said on that. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Mike Zapata. I'm currently working with Citibank. I am a digital accessibility specialist there. I've been there with them for about 3 years now. I kind of consider myself a student and teacher of accessibility. This is actually my 20th year teaching accessibility. I started when I was working with the Department of Labor with the Job Corps program. I was the webmaster there for their online presence at the time. And being the web guy, they told me, well, we need to make our sites Section 508 accessible. You do it. You're the web guy. You know all that stuff. So I had to kind of teach myself. Thankfully, there was a government website called section508.gov, which is still out there, thankfully. And it has a lot of information about that. In that time, Section 508 was the standard for federal government websites. Now, in the last, I would say, 8 years, they aligned with WCAG as well. So now the WCAG standards we're going to be applying for everything that we're talking about today. And of course, you have my contact here. It's michael.zapata@citi.com. That's my work address. So if you have any questions again afterwards, you can go and just send me an email there, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. So, and I think we've already kind of talked about this with, if you were available for the legal update with Eva earlier, when she talked about what is accessibility. Basically, it enables people with disabilities to have the same information and perform the same functions as anyone else. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I have a graphic on this slide that says, keep calm and include everyone, with the accessibility symbol on the top. Again, we want to make sure that we're inclusive as we go along, because again, everyone, I mean, to me, accessibility is about making sure that everybody plays their part, and they can't play their part unless they have that access. So, of course, we're going to talk specifically about PowerPoint in a few moments here. So with that in mind, our course objectives are going to be to, again, prepare for an accessible presentation, design an accessible presentation, in this case, specifically with Microsoft PowerPoint. And finally, we're going to, in this last section, we're going to talk about how to deliver an accessible presentation and things you would do after the fact. So we'll start with our first section, preparation. One thing we want to do is consider the needs of our audience. Some members may have issues that affect their ability to see. Some may have disabilities that affect their ability to hear or even move. Some may also have difficulty speaking. So if you have questions, you want to be able to understand what they're telling you. And also they may have disabilities that may affect their way to understanding. Again, maybe cognitive issues that they may have to deal with. So we want to make sure that what we do in our presentations speaks to all those people. They can be heard by that, and also we want to make sure we can move them and also speak to them so that we can all understand what's going on. One thing to help that along is to ask in advance. If anyone needs an accessibility accommodation. Again, if you're doing a presentation and you do have some time available, maybe a couple of months, maybe a couple of weeks to get ready, ask if any of the attendees are going to have an accommodation you'll need to accommodate for. This could be something like ASL interpreters, American Sign Language. It could be someone who maybe needs access to the room itself. Make sure there's no barriers. If they have any, if they're in a wheelchair, they want to make sure they have a clear path to get to the room. Things of that nature. It's always helpful to ask and also let them volunteer. Some folks may not identify themselves as having a disability, but we want to be cognizant of those that do and make sure we do our best to accommodate them. And one thing we can do is just send an email, maybe rather a message that's asked them directly. You know, in this case, there's an example on the slide that says, I will need the following accommodations in order to participate. And there's several options that they can check. One of these says, email the presentation to me in advance. Another one has USB drive and format. Again, there may be someone using a PC, maybe one using a Macintosh computer. Again, we want to make sure they have the correct format so that way our files are available to them. Again, they may have someone that has the needs of an American Sign Language interpreter. Again, we may also need someone who has wheelchair access, again, to get to the venue. Some of them may be blind and require the use of a Braille version of your presentation. Again, we want to make sure about that. Or it may be, they may be hard of hearing, and so they may need to have the need of an assistive listening device, something to help them hear your presentation as it goes along. Also, some folks may not be blind, but they may have difficulty seeing, so maybe a large print version might help them out. And you can also ask them specifically, what font size will work best for you? And you can present it to them in that way. Of course, if we're doing this live like we're doing today via the web, or if it's going to be archived, say like for a video for later purposes, we need to make sure we have captioning available so that way folks can follow along. And also, again, this is not an inclusive, all-inclusive list, so we do have the option of other. Let them report what they might need if it's not among the ones you've already provided for them as suggestions. And of course, if you're doing a live presentation, you want to make sure that if they have an assistant accompanying to them, that we do have that available as well, that we can make room for those folks. Or if it's a service animal, make room for that animal as well. Now, also with our modern age, when I first started doing this presentation about 10 years ago, it was strictly live interactions. But now we do have this online presence now where we can do things through virtual platforms like Zoom, as we're using here at Access U. There may be other ones like, I'm trying to think of the other ones, like Citrix has one. I forget the name of that one. But then again, there's very many ways you can transmit a presentation live. So we want to make sure we're aware of the platform accessibility features. Again, what things do they offer? Again, Zoom offers transcribing, live transcribing. They also have other methods, so that way if someone has a question, they can also signal that visually through the presentation. Also, if there's any question of them not being able to use those platforms, again, maybe they have a network connection that prevents them from using Zoom or any other thing, like whatever platform you might be using, make sure you're ready to provide them an alternate means to get to your presentation. What we can do is probably present these to them either by email. Again, we can send them to them directly, so they have that available. We can provide it on a website. As I did earlier on the first slide, I have the slide presentation materials on my personal website available. And also, I like to use a portable flash drive. I've carried these around for about maybe 5 years. I've renewed this right before COVID, so I didn't get to use them that first year. But I've used them ever since. And again, whenever anyone needs to use these files, I have these ready to go. But I know sometimes security issues may preclude the use of them, but I just like to be aware and be ready just in case. Any questions on anything we've covered so far? All right, let's move on here. Let's talk about the physical aspects of a venue. Some of these may be architectural, maybe the room size. Again, if it's a very large space, we may need to require like a use of a microphone or a PA system to be heard. Like if it's an auditorium, more than likely you'll have to have some kind of amplification of your own voice to be heard that way. And again, the number of seats, that might affect your visibility. If you're in a room where someone has, again, the need of an American Sign Language interpreter, you want to be able to be close to that person so they can also see you. And as you speak, even though the interpreter's doing their work directly for them, some may be able to have some capacity to read lips and might be helpful for them to see you to be able to help foster their understanding. Also, the other thing I want to consider with a physical venue is the technical aspects. Again, audiovisual equipment, like I have my lavalier microphone here to help me out. If we have a presentation that's being shown on a slide, we want to make sure we have the projector that works fine, things of that nature. Network availability is also a key thing nowadays. We want to make sure we're in a network that everyone can access. Since Zoom is dependent on internet access, we want to make sure that's working. If you're offering a presentation on a local Wi-Fi network, we want to make sure that that's live and always ready to go. And also, one of the things to consider with that is be aware of who's going to help you if anything does go south. So I have my assistant over here, so it can help me if anything does happen. And it's happened before. I actually was in a presentation, I want to say about 7 years ago, not at XSU, but I was working at an employer at the time was Texas Health and Human Services. And we had a dedicated training facility. And one day in the middle of my presentation about PowerPoint, power went out, not just in the building, but in the whole local region we were in. Like I think it was maybe about 20 city blocks. And so luckily we could call someone. They couldn't fix it right away, so we had to cancel the class that day and reschedule, but at least I know who to call in case something crazy happened like that. So again, it's always helpful to be prepared in case something does go wrong. And again, that gives you confidence for your presentation audience to, they kind of go by your confidence. If you're panicked in a situation like that, it adds to their stress. So if you're calm and collected, maybe you're kind of freaking out a little bit, but if everything's going crazy, if you have a measure of confidence, that'll at least help people get out. And I know in that class, I had to get people out because we were in the back of the building. I had to get my phone to get the lights because for some reason, even the emergency lights in the building didn't come on. So I had to kind of help usher people out, make sure everybody got all their things. Somehow somebody left behind an umbrella and we never did find out who it belonged to. So it happens. But luckily that was the only casualty we had that day. So. Huh?
It didn't rain.
No, it didn't rain. No, what it turned out is I think somebody had run into a power pole in the area and somehow they hit the perfect one that knocked out the entire area. So. Again, also with the physical venue, we want to make sure we have reserved seating. And I think I've already touched on that. But again, if you have someone that has any accommodations, again, There may be seats specifically for someone in front of an ASL interpreter. If they have a service animal with them, we want to make sure they have space available for that. One thing to also consider in mind, there may be some folks who maybe have allergies to dogs. So it might be helpful to realize, oh, if I have someone who's maybe very allergic, maybe it might be helpful to have them separated. Maybe put the dog and that person further away from someone with the allergies to accommodate them as well. Again, luckily now with our remote technologies, that's less of an issue because sometimes folks maybe, if they realize that they have allergies, maybe they figure, oh, I'll just stay home that day just to make sure I don't get set off. But again, we want to be prepared for anything that might occur as best as we can. And I know I've touched on this several times, the ASL interpreter, which I think is one of my favorite folks that works out to help audiences. One thing you can do to help them do their job is provide them with the technical terms. And usually when we're offering our presentations, we're offering new knowledge for a new audience. And even for the ASL interpreter, it might be something that's new to them. So if you can offer them a copy of your presentation ahead of time, they may have a quick way to sign things much more efficiently, much more succinctly. If they're doing it live, sometimes they can do it letter by letter. But of course, they may have a special gesture that sums up a word much more succinctly and makes their job work a little easier that way. And again, I've touched on this a couple of times so far. We want to make sure that they have good seating and visibility. And also we want to make sure that if you have a very long presentation, here at Access U, we have some breaks so we can break it up. But had we had a very long presentation and someone was in the room needed the services of an ASL interpreter, we probably would have had one interpreter in here for maybe the first hour and maybe another one to kind of tag team with them for the second hour and so forth. Because again, even though these guys I think are superheroes, they do need their rest. And so there's only so much that they can do in one sitting. We want to make sure that they have that. One note to think about the good seating and visibility. If you're one of those folks, in my younger days would wander about across the stage and, do my thing, which again could also maybe be difficult for some folks as they do their presentation. It may be a little disconcerting for some audience members. So I kind of have pulled back on that in my personal experience. But I remember I was at one conference where they mentioned, and this is a story I heard about somebody else's presentation, where they had someone who's giving the presentation, was walking across the stage, they had an ASL interpreter doing their work, and they would constantly walk in the path of the interpreter and the people they were serving. So they themselves became the barrier for the understanding. Even though they were the presenter, they were short-circuiting that by that. So it's kind of be cognizant of, if you're one of those that moves around, just be aware of where you move, not to be in the way. Again, we want to make sure we have people understand and not get in the way of that understanding. And also along those lines of hearing impediments, there's captioning and listening devices. There's a technology called CART, Communication Access Real-Time Translation. Now with our new platforms, that's kind of become almost an obsolete technology, but it's still out there. If you're in government, I know with Texas, when I worked with Texas Health and Human Services, we did constantly use those for any large town hall presentations we had. And that was helpful for, I know myself, I tended to be in the back of the rooms when we had those, but it was helpful for, sometimes the audio wasn't quite that great in the room, but I could read the screen because they had a large enough print that I could read it from the back of the room. So even though I didn't have any audio impairments, it was helpful for me in those kind of circumstances. And that's one thing I think I like about assistive technology is that it helps everyone. It may not help you for your specific thing, but it may make your life a little easier in other ways that, again, you may have a disability that's directly related to it, but it may help you in other ways. Similar to that, we have like audio transcripts, which again, we have through our Zoom, and also video captions. Again, that's helpful for like if you record your presentation and want to have it put up somewhere, say like on the YouTube channel, and have that recorded for posterity, you have those captions available there. I know YouTube has their auto captioning available, which is actually getting really good every year, but it's not 100%. So it's always helpful that if you have use of that service, always go back in there and make sure that auto transcription or caption is correct, because sometimes it mishears things and it doesn't quite get your message right. So I always say that if you use that service, make sure you go back there and double check, make sure everything that's being said is what you actually said. And also, if you go to some venues, especially here in Austin, there's some like theaters, churches, community centers, they have what they call assistive listening devices, ALDs for short. And there's actually a website called aldlocator.com. And you can plug in your local zip code, and it'll show you locations around your area that do offer these these devices to help their audiences. And it also has different technologies for that. Some of them are based on Wi-Fi, some use loop technology, others may use infrared or even radio signals to transmit the audio that way to those audiences. So I always find that a really helpful thing. Most often, I've seen this more often in theaters, movie theaters, again, because it's helpful for audio described movies. But again, other places are also using that as well, especially like larger convention centers. So any questions so far as what we discussed? All right. And finally, on our section today, slide 16, we are talking about the Braille handouts. Again, if we go over in a presentation, if someone may be blind and may not be able to see the visual aspects of our PowerPoint, we want to make sure they have that same information. So what we can do is replace the graphics themselves with the descriptions. We'll go more into that about what the alt text would be for these kind of images in a later section. But again, we want to make sure we have that available so that way when we rather export the PowerPoint file into a Word document, we can apply headings and make sense of the document in a way that would make sense to someone that's going to be receiving the Braille output of that. And in the training files I have accompanying this presentation, I have a list on the notes section of this particular slide of how you would do that in PowerPoint. But again, for time, I have that kind of saved off for now. But maybe if we have time later on, I can demo that for you. But it's something that's very helpful. Again, like I said, for folks that may have that need. And with that, we've come to the end of our first section. Let's go ahead and take about a 3-minute break if you need, and then we'll resume and get to our basically the biggest portion of our presentation, which is design. So let's see, we are at 2:34. We'll be back at 2:37. So, alrighty, back at time 2:37. So we'll continue on. And again, did anybody have any questions about our first section so far? Just so I can kind of address those now. All right, now this is what I call the fun part, design with PowerPoint. One thing we want to do is we can use PowerPoint standard templates and styling features that are already built in. Some folks may look for those online. They get those special templates that are out there. They may or may not be accessible. So we want to be kind of careful with those. But again, PowerPoint does have its own templates already built in. It does have 9. One of them says title slide. Another one is title and content. One is called section header. One is to content. One is called comparison. Another one's called title only. One is totally blank, has no placeholders whatsoever on it. And there's also the two last ones are content with caption and picture with caption. Again, these are some special case ones that are available built into PowerPoint. Of these 9, any of these would be helpful to start a presentation. If you're going to start from scratch, you can use any of these 9, except for 2. Those would be the title only, which only has a placeholder for a title. It has nothing else available to put in content. And there's also one that's blank. Again, that one's totally blank. There's no placeholders on that. And that's the one I think most people tend to use. But unfortunately, that's where most of the problems start when they use PowerPoint. They'll use what they call text boxes, which again are not, they are somewhat accessible to someone using a screen reader, but they're not always. And so I always recommend not using any of that. Even though it's kind of a shortcut to add content to a slide, I always recommend use a template that already has placeholders in there, maybe more than what you need. And that way you can fill in the content as you need. You can always delete the ones you don't use or just leave them empty. When you have a presentation live or a file, most of the times that content will not be read to someone using a screen reader. So again, you can adapt that to your needs. Yes, you have a question up front. Uh-huh. Yes, they are. Mhm. We'll get into that a little bit more, but again, as they are, what makes these accessible, at least from first use right there, is that the fact that they are what we call content placeholders. And that's very distinct to know, because again, in PowerPoint usage, typically people will get a slide, add in a text box. And a text box is actually a different thing in terms of how Microsoft works with PowerPoint. It does allow you to add content. Visually, it seems identical. But again, someone who uses a text box, it may not make that content available to someone using a screen reader. There may be some difficulties with that. In the past, it was actually much worse. It would usually not even recognize it. The screen reader would encounter text box, skip it past until they got to another item that did have a placeholder and read the content within that. So like I said, that's why I recommend not using the title only or the blank, because it kind of, you sidestep the whole issue of using text boxes entirely. Any of the other 7 are perfectly fine, because you can always make those however you need. You can adjust them, make them longer, shorter, and again, delete the ones you don't need. Say like you have one that has 5, but you only need 4 of the placeholders. You can delete the 5th, resize them as you need, and everything will be fine. Again, we're just starting here, but it's a very good question you asked there. So let's continue on. And again, one thing we can also use is a slide master. This is where we can set our styles within a PowerPoint. Something that I know some folks do when they use PowerPoint is that they do each slide individually. They'll make changes here on, say, slide A, changes to slide B, even though they look identical otherwise. Even the positioning of the objects may be the same. And even if they are using the placeholders, they're identical. But if they're using a slide master, it does make your job as a creator a lot more efficient, because that way you can set up the backgrounds if you need. If, say, like you have a certain, in this case, on my particular slide background, I have a kind of a blue banner across the back to highlight the white text of the title at the very top. Again, that's part of the background, but I applied it to every single slide via the slide master. If I wanted to change the background, I could change my entire presentation in one swipe instead of having to go to each and every slide granularly and swapping out backgrounds manually in that respect. So I always think that slide master is not only helpful for accessibility, they're also very helpful just to save you time as a creator in PowerPoint. And again, use the built-in placeholders that are there. You can adjust those to however you need. We're going to get into customization a little bit more. But before we get too far along, or actually, before I get ahead of myself, we already talked about placeholders, how they're different from content. And there's actually a different settings within the placeholders within PowerPoint itself. You can, on this one, there are 6 icons available. There is a generic placeholder in PowerPoint that allows you to apply tables, graphs, data from a database, video, web links, and also embedded video as well. 6 options. And there are actually placeholders that will allow you to do one of those. So you can have a dedicated placeholder just say for, like I said, tables, or just for graphs. But I recommend using the one that allows you to do all 6 of those things at once. Because again, you could change that out. Maybe you decide, well, rather than the graph on this particular slide, I want this placeholder to have text instead. And that gives you a lot more freedom. Again, it makes your job easier as a creator in PowerPoint to do that, rather than setting yourself with just one particular slide, and then you have to swap out the entire placeholder because you just have the wrong kind for you. So this makes your job a little easier. Just look for one, like I said, that has all 6 placeholders built in. And most of them do within the PowerPoint templates that I showed, or the layouts that are built into PowerPoint. It gives you that freedom from the get-go. You have a question there?
Content for writing in those, among those 6?
Well, by default, you can write in any of these.
In here.
Right, but if you have the ones that dedicated only for, again, just for tables, you could only write within the context of the table you're inserting into that. So again, like I said, this is probably the one that gives you the most freedom in terms of your creation. So very quick question. Any other questions related to this? All right. Well, let's step back a little bit and just think about how we even create our slides. Some folks will put a lot of information in their slides. Information overload is something we see very common with PowerPoint. Again, for those of you that work in government, you may sometimes see slides where they have statutes quoted in depth entirely, all on this span that we have available within this slide. You can break that up. You can put, say, the subsections, maybe the title of the statute and the various subsections on different slides. One of the great things about PowerPoint is that you basically have almost a near infinite number of slides you can use. I don't know if you want to make a presentation that long. At that point, you might want to use Word, because that's a better way for that, convey that kind of immensity of information. But for a particular slide itself, I always recommend for everyone, not just for people with cognitive disabilities, but limit your slides to just one idea. You know, if you have something that's really dense, maybe break that idea up into 2 sub ideas and put those on multiple slides. And even if you have one idea, again, that idea may be very dense, but you want to be able to sum it up in maybe 3 or 4 list items. Again, very quickly. I know most presenters will do a slide and then talk about it, like I've been doing today. I put some information on the screen and I elaborate on top of that. That seems to be the style. I've seen some presentations where people only have 4 slides in their presentation, but then they speak for an hour, 15 minutes on each slide. That's perfectly fine. But as long as your context is there, it's helpful to have that information in bite-sized chunks. It's helpful for people for recall. It's also helpful for understanding. And also, again, if you have list items, you may not have list items, but you may have lines of text. I would recommend maybe not more than 5 or 6 lines, because again, the density. One thing about PowerPoint, it's very helpful in that, but it makes it very dense on a slide. And I would also recommend not using not more than 5 or 6 words per line, be it a text or a list item, because again, the brevity helps you in terms of understanding. Because most people won't read your entire slide. And I know conversely, there's also some presenters that will read your entire slide to you. And that can get a little monotonous if there's a lot of information on the slide. So if you're well, and again, there's nothing wrong with reading slides verbatim, but it makes your job as a presenter to just read it if there's only a couple of lines on the slide, rather than to read the entire tome that might be on there. So helps everybody out. Now, in PowerPoint, one of my favorite tools for accessibility checking, the accessibility of a PowerPoint presentation, is the outline view. And this is available if you go to the view section of the ribbon and you go to the presentation view section. By default on PowerPoint, this is in the normal view, the one we're accustomed to, where it has the thumbnails along the left pane. The main body has basically the main view of the slide itself. What this is, it changes that left pane to an outline view that shows you all the textual content of a slide. And this is where the distinction about using the placeholders and text boxes is very important. If you have something that's in a placeholder, all that information textually will appear in this outline view. And that's helpful if, again, you're creating a Braille version of the slide, because when you create that Braille version, you're outputting the contents of the outline view. If you have a content that's within a place, or rather within a text box, that text, even though it's visibly there, will not appear in the outline view. And that one may not translate when you make into a Braille version of your presentation. So that information may be lost for those users. So I always recommend the best as you can, even if you have plain text on a slide, always use the placeholders, because that way that text will be recorded here, and also, like I said, in the outline view of the slide itself. Now, you may have images, and again, being that these are based on images and not text, none of these items will appear in the outline view. Again, this is a text-based view of your presentation. Again, we'll talk more about how we do the text alternatives for images later. But again, if someone's going to use this PowerPoint slide for a Braille conversion, we want to make sure that everything is available in the outline view. And yes. No, go ahead. Go ahead. Oh, yeah, bring them. I was a question raised, and we'll hear it shortly.
Just a quick question. What is your suggestion then for images that are not in the outline view, or tables that are not in the outline view, to make them output to different assistive technologies?
We'll get to that in just a moment. That's a very good question. I love it when the crowd always anticipates what I'm going to tell you, because I've actually had people ask me, what if we do this? And it's the answer of what I was going to say already. So I like audiences that do that. So thank you for the very good question, and we will be answering that shortly. So I appreciate that. So again, going from the outline view, we can also use that to help us find any duplicate titles we may have in our slides. One thing that's very disconcerting for someone who maybe is using a screen reader, they may come across a slide that has the same title across multiple slides. In this particular example, I have a before example, which has 5 slides listed. The titles of them are Avoid Fully Justified Text, one that says Images, another one that says Images, and then one that says Adding Alt Text, and then Exercise 3. And again, you can see the difficulty. If there are 2 or more slides with the same title, in this case, Images, that can cause that person to lose track of where they're at. Especially maybe with 1 or 2, they may be able to negotiate that, but that's more trouble than it's worth, I think, for them. But if you had multiple slides that had the same title, and I've seen presentations where they'll use the same title for 10 or more slides, that can become very confusing, and that person can become really lost really quickly. So what I always recommend to make the titles unique is use what I call the X of Y method. So if you have a series of slides that may have the same title, in this case, I've taken the first image, the first slide title that said Images, and I call that 1 of 2, because there's 2 slides that have that image title, or Images title. And so I made the first one 1 of 2, and the second one 2 of 2. And again, we can extrapolate. If you had a series of 4, then you would have 1 of 4, 2 of 4, 3 of 4, 4 of 4. And this is again helpful. So that way it makes them all unique. It also is helpful for people negotiating. I guess, again, if they're using a screen reader, they'll know exactly which of those slides about images they're on, as they go through the outline view. It's also helpful for someone who's listening to your presentation, maybe online, and you're talking about the images slide. Well, if you say images 1 of 2, oh, they're on the first one. And as I alluded to earlier about the instance where they had 10 slides with the same title, that makes it a little more easier to negotiate. It also allows a bit of a release for that user because they can say, oh, he's still talking about images. We're on the 8th one, 8 of 9. Okay, we're almost at the end. 9 of 9, we're done. We're done with that topic. I don't have to hear him talk anymore about that. So again, it gives that audience a little sense of release. Also for you as a creator, it's also helpful so that way you can kind of keep track of your ideas as well. One good thing about the outline view is that when you can actually type in this as well, and it'll reflect what's on the main body of the slide itself. So if you change the title in the slide, in the title placeholder, it will update here automatically, and vice versa. If I decided to make that change here, it'll make that on the slide body itself at the same time. You don't have to worry about doing 2 things at once. I mean, rather 2 things to make sure everything's tracked. It does 2 things at the same time. So it makes it a lot easier. And with that, we're going to go to our first exercise. You have a question back there? Oh, there's the microphone.
Pet peeve.
Uh-huh.
I know a little bit about accessibility with PowerPoint, and one of the things that I've always used is the outline view.
Mhm.
And our agency has a tendency to use smart art to make them look pretty and to use the little icons. But the minute you go to the outline view, all you see is the titles, because the content that is in those smart art doesn't show up in the outline view.
Right.
And I have gotten pushback on them wanting to continue to use the smart art because it's the slide, I'm using air quotes, it's the way that it's always looked in every of the presentations. And so I'm looking forward to saying, well, you know what, that's actually, even though Microsoft says it's accessible, it's not accessible for any other purpose other than visual.
Right, exactly. The problem with smart art, and it's a very good point that you brought that up now, smart art is actually based on the same mechanism as text boxes. And that's part of the reason why historically they've had issues with assistive technology because of that, because it was meant to be more of a visual-based shortcut to add content to a slide. But in Microsoft's infinite wisdom, they decided, well, let's add text as well. And then somebody decided, well, what if we made the text fancy with smart art? But they use the same underlying engine. And so that's why when you have smart art that may have visual looking text on that, none of it can fade into the outline view, because again, it's not a text-based solution. So that your pet peeve is very well learned. Hopefully you feed it well. All right, so let's go on to our first exercise. Those of you playing along at home, we're going to switch over to our other file, the exercise file. And we have that here up on screen. Let me expand this a little more so we can see it a little better. And we'll go to our outline view. Again, we're going to go up to the view up in the ribbon. For those of you who can see the cursor, I'm up there selecting on that. And again, this is also one of the good things about Microsoft. You can actually navigate to that using the keyboard as well. So, but again, for brevity, I'm going to do it the way I usually do it because I am sighted, so I do it that way. So I acknowledge my privilege with that. So again, going to the tab, the view tab in the ribbon, we'll select that. We go to the presentation view, which is the first section of the ribbon that we currently have up on top. As you can see, it's currently selected as normal, and I'm going to change that to outline view, and that brings that up there. Now we have the content of at least this exercise file. And for those of us who can see, can anyone volunteer? What's the issue that we have right there?
Can someone share the link in
What
the
we have
chat?
going on is that we have duplicate side titles. Actually, no, we don't. My mistake. All right, I'm correcting this, or rather uncorrecting this. So now we do have an error. My apologies for that. That was my preparation. I got that wrong. So in this case now, we do have identical slide titles. We have one that says describing the graph twice for slides 4 and 5 of this particular exercise file. So right there, that's the error. We need to make sure that these are unique. And again, we could say, and I'm going to do this directly on the outline view. For those of you who can see it, it's very kind of small, but I'm going to type in 1 of 2. Whoops, that way if I write it correctly. On the first. And 2 of 2. And as you can see on the slide here directly, as I'm typing that in, that is appearing on the slide itself as I'm making these edits in the outline view. Again, it does both things, rather, it makes the change, but it makes it appear in 2 spots. So it saves you that work of doing it that way. Likewise, if I went to the slide itself and made a change there, you can see how that's changing that. Those of us who can see that is doing that change live on the slide body, but also updating that within the outline view. Again, that's helpful. I know you guys are smart in this, so I'm going to preemptively ask the question is like, well, what if you only have 2 slides? Do you have to do the X of Y? Can I just use continue? Yeah, that's perfectly fine. But the trap with that, inevitably, somebody says, well, I have 2 slides on the same topic. One is, slide topic, whatever. Second slide topic, whatever. 2, continued. But I want to add a third. What are you going to call the third one? Sometimes you hear conclude. That's a good one. I like that idea. It's a very good idea because you're making it unique. So I give you brownie points for that because you're thinking out of the box, which I love, outside of the text box, as it were. But some folks will actually just say, well, just call it slide topic, whatever, continued. Slide topic, whatever, continued. They'll use continued twice, which puts us back in the initial problem of having ununique slides. So again, that's why I tend to prefer the 1 of 2. Because inevitably, if you have a topic, you may decide to add more to it. And this kind of keeps your discipline up by just doing that. Even if it's just 2, I recommend just using the X of Y method for that. Exactly. Can you repeat that into the microphone? I want people to hear that. It's a very good comment.
He said again? Okay, so the other one is like the Energize the Bunny approach. So it just keeps going and going and going.
Very good comment. So, like I said, we want to avoid those situations where we can. So, any questions about using the outline view or working with the duplicate side titles? Yes, in the back there. Do we have any on Zoom, by the way?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I'll work on that. Somebody asked about the question of the zip file links. I'll fix that. But your question here in the room.
So if you use something like Canva first and you convert it to a PowerPoint, is there any way to remediate that outline view
Yeah.
without it duplicating on both screens? I mean, the text doesn't show up.
Well, for Canva, I'm not too familiar with it, but I know it's very inaccessible already. So any errors it introduces, you will have to probably fix them manually within PowerPoint.
Mhm.
That's probably the only remediation method that I'm aware of that you can do that.
And so there's no way to add anything over there without it adding it to the other slide.
No, because this is
Okay.
just the way that PowerPoint works.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
So one thing to keep in mind, Canva is proprietary, so is PowerPoint via Microsoft. So lots of proprietary things don't play well with one another. And we see that often with PowerPoints and say PDFs or Word and PDF and things of that nature. We do the best we can, and that's what these classes are about, to help you with those kind of things. But yeah, with Canva, I've never been a big fan of. Figma is another one I'm not really a big fan of in terms of from an accessibility standpoint. And when people use those to generate PowerPoints, it does seem a little strange to me. Why not just start with the PowerPoint and go from there? Because you have a comment, go ahead. Get in the microphone, please.
Because a lot of times, especially like my agency, we have the paid version of that. You can use more graphics and other text that you can't in PowerPoint. So that's why we start in Canva and then remediate in PowerPoint. But I've never seen the outline view before.
Yeah.
So that was my
No,
question.
good.
But those are some reasons why you would start in the other one. It's also more user friendly, in my opinion.
Which, PowerPoint or Canva?
Canva. But I know that it is not known for being accessible.
That's why it's not user friendly.
Yeah, for certain
certain users it
let me,
is,
yeah,
but
let me
maybe.
rephrase that.
Well,
For
give them
certain
that.
users, it may be more user friendly,
Right.
but not for everyone.
Right, right. That's why, and that's in there, if you allow me to send monologue here for a little bit. I've seen a lot of companies will use various things to produce content. And it's kind of like a hammer and nail situation. It's like, well, we have this tool. It's been provided for us, and we have to use it for everything. I've seen people use that for Figma, in web design. They'll do everything in Figma, but the coding, because there's no way you can do code in Figma totally, and you have issues with that. I've seen that in other agencies when I used to work with the Texas state government. They would take PowerPoints and create posters, documents, that you would normally maybe use something like, Illustrator or InDesign for that kind of work. Or they would create documents that probably be better used off in Word for some reason, but they were comfortable with using PowerPoint. That was the hammer for every nail that they had. And I always recommend that whatever you're using, everything has its best things. Canva is great for what its use purpose is meant for. Again, it does have accessibility issues, but it is good for what it was meant to be used for. But trying to use that for everything usually fails. Same thing with PowerPoint. I would not use, even though I made the joke earlier about maybe you can use an infinite amount of slides of PowerPoint, that would be a poor use of PowerPoint. I would recommend then use Word and then add images to that kind of thing. Because again, we want to make sure whatever we're using is appropriate for what we're trying to convey. So I didn't want to put some shade on you for that. So, all right, so let's go ahead and go back to our main regularly scheduled presentation. And we'll continue with what we were talking about. In this case, we're going to look at visibility of titles. Let me bring that up a little better there. And this brings up another tool that I really love in PowerPoint. This is what we call the selection pane. This is an item that you can get from if you go to the ribbon, select on the drawing section, there's an arrange icon there, and that'll bring up a menu where you can select the selection pane from that. And again, we'll go through that in a little more detail, how you get to that. But what that does is produces a pane on the right side of the PowerPoint screen that shows you the placeholders you have within a given slide. Also, if you had any text boxes, that would also appear here as well. And what this does is allows you to be able to control the visibility of items you have there. And this is helpful for, like, sometimes you have a presentation where you have multiple sections, and sometimes the sections are defined by, say, a picture. And doesn't have any textual content on it, at least visible content, but it kind of defines the beginning of a new section of the presentation. That's kind of a common, I wouldn't say not so much anymore, but it's still out there that people use it that way with PowerPoint. So what I would recommend for those kind of situations is that you can actually apply text and to make it invisible here within the selection pane, but it will still be visible within the outline view. Again, the selection pane is separate from the outline view because not only does it appear on different slides of the presentation view itself, but they do two different things. This one more controls the visibility of objects and something else which we'll get into a little later in the presentation. So keep that in mind. So let's go back to our exercise file. Let me bring that up for our next exercise. And right here is an example of what I was talking about. You have a slide where it's being used to introduce a new section. In this case, what's pictured is actually this is a picture of the planet Saturn from the rear view. I believe it was not New Horizons, I think it was the Galileo probe that was going out that way in the solar system. And it turned around and took a photograph of Saturn from the rear view that we typically don't see, from our vantage point here on Earth. And even though you can't really see it on this particular screen because it's very kind of washed out, there is in the high resolution, there's a dot right there below Saturn that's actually a picture of the Earth. So had it been a more high res version, I could have an arrow and say, this is we are here underneath the view of Saturn in this picture. But I digress. What we're doing here is we're using this to show us a picture, like I said, that we want to have some, maybe not the visual content of the slide or the title appearing, but again, we want to make sure everything has a title and a unique one. So we want to make sure that's available here. So I'll bring in the outline view here. Let me go back to home as we would the default. And again, on your default slide, you go to arrange, select that particular option that would bring down the drop down there. The last option on that is the selection pane. When I select that, it'll bring up my images are in the way, so let me move that out of the way. There we go. For visibility's sake, we can see it a little better. Can you move the, yeah, just kind of bring it down for those at home. There we go. selection pane, and we have a title there, but we can't see it on the slide itself. We just see the picture. In this case, there's a placeholder, and you can see where I have the little icon X'd out. It looks like an eye with a slash through it. And that's the indicator that Microsoft uses to indicate that that is invisible to view. Now, if I were to make that visible again, just like as we saw with the title, we have the title of the slide, and it says hiding the title, which is the title of the slide. But because I hit it visually, it's still there. Again, we want to have a title. So if I go back to the outline view and look at it there, you'll note in the outline view for this particular slide, which is slide 2, or rather, slide 2, it has a title, hiding a title. Even though for those of us that can see it, visually on the slide itself, there is no title visible. We've hidden it within the selection pane. And so with this, again, this is a very accessible way of accommodating this kind of situation because it accommodates that kind of visual need of, well, I don't want the visual clutter of a title appearing on the slide, but for someone who maybe cannot see that, that's irrelevant. They want to make sure that we have the title there, and that is visible to them, or rather available to them within the outline view. So they do get that, and that's what makes this particular technique accessible in that way. Exactly. Again, like any other slide, it must have a title. So it's there. It's just that for those of us with sight, it's invisible for our view right now. No, what I would do, just like any other title. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Hello.
Yes,
How did you insert that? How did
it
the,
was already there. Because I use a placeholder called title. I typed in the content, just like I would any other title. And I'm adjusting that title right now. But in the selection pane, I made that invisible by clicking on the icon that rendered it invisible. So like I said, the selection pane and the outline view are two different portions of the PowerPoint.
so in other words,
Hmm?
you selected for the selection pane, there was nothing there, but you entered it into that space, a title, and that's what shows then.
Right,
Okay.
yeah, because like I said, just like
So
any,
it comes up as blank over there. It's
no,
on
no,
the
no,
side.
it'll have it here. Because it's already a placeholder native to the layout I used here. Because this
Oh,
layout
it's
had,
native. Okay.
it had
Sorry.
a title portion, title placeholder, and a
Right.
content placeholder there. So
Okay.
I'm sorry if that confused you, but yeah,
Yes.
you raised a very good point. So it's there already. I insert my content. I just made that visible here in the selection pane. One also good thing, which I love about the selection pane, I think I'm going to monologue here a little bit. It's helpful for removing cruft out of PowerPoint presentations. I'm sure many of you have gotten a slide presentation and someone, maybe your boss gave you, it's like, here, use this one. You can redo what was there before, delete it all, what have you, just use this particular template, whatever's there. But sometimes when stuff gets kind of inherited to other people, changing hands, especially in government, you may not have been you might not even be the first 10 of the first 10 people to handle this particular file. And so a lot of cruft will accumulate and it may be invisible again, because somebody may have figured out, oh, I can hide it. No one will know. Well, of course, if it's in a placeholder, it'll appear in the outline view, which causes a lot of clutter that way. But what this can also do, and we see this quite often enough, you can have placeholders here that don't apply to anything, especially text boxes. Like I said, text boxes will also appear in the selection pane. So if there's a lot of empty text boxes that don't do anything, you can go in here and select each one and delete them and remove it. It's a manual process. Again, if there's a lot of cruft in the entire slide presentation all the way through, but again, it helps lighten the load in the file itself. I remember there was one time I was working on a file that had a page number in the lower right-hand quadrant of the slide. And I was not aware of the selection pane at that point. And I could not get rid of it. I was like, why is this number 3 not going away? I've deleted it. I've deleted it. I've deleted it at least 50 times. It still won't go. And by some fury of my fingers flying across the keyboard, I hit the special keyboard command that brings in that, which is Alt F10, which hides the selection pane and also reveals it. And by doing that, I realized it's in a placeholder. And I've only deleted a few of those because it had a whole string of them stacked visually in the same space on the screen. But there was like maybe another 30 of them. And I was like, oh, I'm not insane. So I was able to select the mass of them and then delete them and save me probably a good another hour and a half. Because again, PowerPoint files can get really crufty, as I call them. Yes, another question.
If people open up the presentation file, the PowerPoint, and they're using a screen reader and they're navigating it not using the outline view, like maybe just the editing view or maybe the present view,
Mhm.
or maybe it's like in PowerPoint Live with Teams, content that is visually hidden on that slide, will that still be caught? Like, will a screen reader still recognize that in those different views?
They should be able to, because you can actually navigate, someone using a screen reader, I believe it's Shift F function 6, can allow you to bounce from whatever's in this left-hand pane to the main pane we typically work in, the notes, and also any panes you have to the right-hand side. And again, the ones on the left and the right will change depending on what you've selected. We're going to get into the one about alt text, and that appears on this side, preview for that section. So, but you can navigate something like that. And any of the components within, like I said, like the title in this case, the picture placeholder that's listed here, you can navigate to those as you would any other function. So that's one of the good things that PowerPoint can do, allow you to do that if you're using the screen reader. It's just that when it's editing, like I said, if there's a lot of stuff to navigate through, that's a chore for anybody to deal with. So, but a very good question. Thank you for that. Any other questions? All righty. Let's go back to our next, or regularly scheduled program. Let me enlarge that for the folks at home. Any questions from anybody on Zoom just yet? All righty. How many people we got out there anyway? 13, not bad. Cool. That makes me happy. Because I'm a presenter. I like it when people show up. Okay, all right. Our next slide here is slide 27 about font choices. And so you may have heard this discussion about, whether serif fonts or sans serif fonts, are any of those better or worse for accessibility? Really, there is no single best accessible font that's out there, but there are some that are better than others. And even though there was kind of a discussion maybe about, I'd say even up until about 5 years ago, about whether serif fonts were better than non-serif fonts, there really isn't any difference between the two, I think, because it's not so much whether you have the little ligatures that you see on serif fonts, like on this particular presentation, or they're on this particular slide, as opposed to the ones that don't have the serif fonts, the sans French for without, on these particular examples we have here. So just to let you know, we do have the serif fonts we have listed on this particular slide are Garamond, Georgia, and Times New Roman, which are probably fairly commonly used ones. Sans serif fonts are represented by the Arial, Tahoma, and Verdana fonts. And you can see these are very different styles. These are all actually all at the same size in terms of their point size. These are at 32. And you can see how that affects the differences in terms of how they're rendered on the screen. So that might affect your choice of what you're going to choose. And again, all of these are very good. I personally, my favorite is Verdana, and if those of you who have not noticed so far, I tend to use that exclusively throughout everything, except for this particular slide, throughout this presentation, because of the fact that Verdana has very unique character styles for each of the characters that you have. Letters, numbers, they all have very unique ones. You will never confuse them for anything else. And here's an example of that. We have four fonts pictured on this slide. We have Gill Sans MT, Verdana, again, my favorite, Arial, and Times New Roman. And all of these have the same text that they're displaying. It's the number 1, followed by the word Illinois, the state name. And for those of us who can see it, those are rendered in very different ways because of the fonts that they have. Like in this case, for Gill Sans MT, it has a capital 1, rather a number 1, capital I, and an lowercase L. And those are all rendered the same as vertical lines, no ligatures. For Verdana, we have, again, the number 1 that has the ligatures that define it very distinctly. We have a capital I that has the little bars at the top at the bottom. And then the lowercase l is vertical lines. 3 different styles for 3 different letters, very distinct, or characters. Arial is a little bit okay. It's better than Gill Sans because you can actually see the 1. It has that ligature. However, the capital I and the lowercase l are identical. Vertical straight lines, no ligatures, no differences. Times New Roman, again, very distinct. Again, we can tell clearly what the number 1 is. We do have the capital I, and we do have the lowercase l and I. Now, these are distinct because for those of us who can see it, the lowercase l is actually taller than the number 1 in this example for Times New Roman. However, the difference is very slight. You know, unless you had a measuring stick to measure precisely how tall they were, you might confuse the lowercase l for the number 1, at least with Times New Roman. So my boy, Verdana, is why I tend to use that one because it's very distinct. So again, I'm not saying that you have to use that for all occasions, but when you're making your choices, try to use those that, again, have more unique letter styles, letter shapes, so it can kind of help you convey your message better. And the only reason I put that up there is because a friend of mine was really hoping that Illinois was going to make it this year in basketball, and it didn't happen. No. All right, let's go on to text size. And for those of us who can see, smaller sizes are very hard or harder to read than those that might be larger sizes. And on the slide I have here pictured, I have text that has 10 points, or rather 12 points, 18 points, and 24 points. And those are the smaller ones of the examples I have here. The larger ones are 32, 40, and 44 points respectively. And again, this is a very large screen. I would say it's maybe what, like 7 by 8 foot across. And even in a room like this, the 12-point font may seem very small. And on the screen in front of you, that might be very small as well. If you're looking at a presentation, say for some reason on your phone, that 12-point might even be totally invisible because it's so small. Again, what may be helpful for you in terms of how you look at it might not be helpful for someone else. So I always recommend, if you can, literally go big or go home, because the bigger sizes help out. Also, the good thing about using the bigger sizes, it kind of helps you from cramming everything into a slide. One thing about PowerPoint, as we talked about earlier, it will fit as much as you can, as much as you give it. And sometimes you'll figure out a way to overload it, and your content will spill over across the bottom edge or even the right edge. But sometimes PowerPoint will try to make the best of it. It's like, well, they're putting a lot of information here. Let me shrink down the font so I can make sure everything fits within the canvas we have here. But by doing so, it makes the font very small, and that makes it hard to read. Question up front.
Just gonna ask your opinion. For presentations, do you normally use those larger sizes? Is that
Yes.
the go-to sizes
Yes.
that you use? Okay.
Yeah.
It's good to know.
If there is a hard rule that I tend to go by, go no lower than anything smaller than 24 is probably not going to be your friend in those occasions. I tend to go bigger. That's why I say, that's why I figure that's about the smallest you can go.
Yeah, I had one that I have found, and it's kind of in my visual opinion, that if you start getting the fonts too big, they're too much to take in for somebody. So I usually end up being, you know, and trying to keep the title fonts the same size all the way through, whatever that is. But I start finding out that to get into 40, 44, it's like, it's, you know, it's more difficult for people with especially eye motility issues,
Mhm.
visual perception issues. It gets to be a bit too much for them, in my
Right.
in my image opinion.
Oh, it's a very good
Like-
point. Like I said, I tend to use 44 as my upper extreme. Because again, I have seen some people go with bigger, like 55, I mean, not 55, 56, even 72, even especially for titles, very tall, big titles. But at that point, they're kind of competing with their content, I think, if they go with a very big size. And it might be helpful to have a larger size for legibility. But I tend to live, like I said, these are the ones I tend to live in most. And for this presentation, I tend to go with the 32. That seems to be my happy medium. But I also allow it so that way people can adjust it as their own. Because if you have more space, going back to the idea of having more space on your slides, if someone prefers a larger slide, they can adjust your slides and make that bigger for their, you know, to their needs. So if they think that maybe 44 might help them out better than 32, they have space available, and PowerPoint won't fight them and try to cram it to a smaller size. So that goes back to my earlier point of just try not to overload your slide with information, and the font size will help out as well in that respect. So any other questions on text and so forth? One in the back there.
I
think the font size also plays the difference in, like you said, how much content you put on there. Because I know that I actually get annoyed when people read me the exact text that's on the screen. And so if you really have to put that much information on there, you should break the slides up.
Mhm.
That way you can use the larger sizes to make them more readable. Because I've seen plenty of presentations in our organizations that are 24 or smaller.
Mhm.
But if you can just use either something that you can, that's a textual reminder of what it's supposed to be and speak to it versus having to put everything, every sentence that you're speaking on the screen, I think that's going to help the presentations in the long run because you're going to have your notes. And if you're going to distribute this, then they can read those notes to see what the content was that you were talking about.
Right. That's a very good point. For those of us who have the access to the files, and I'll make sure I can figure out what's going on with that link earlier. In the notes of these slides, I have most of the notes I'm talking about extemporaneously right here. I mean, I am riffing a little bit on them, but most of the details I have that I think might be supportive, I put that in my notes here at the bottom. And that's helpful, again, if you're doing a presentation and you have like the presenter slide and then the audience slide, because I've seen people do both versions. That's perfectly fine too, because I've seen people worry about like, I want to need to have everything all in one file. For you, that's perfectly fine, but for your audience, they may not need to have all that information. But it also works the other way around. Like I said, I like to have all my notes down here as well. One, so that way it reminds me as I go along, but also if I forget a point, it's there. The main points I want people to have are either up on the top, and then I would say the secondary points are in the bottom that support the main ones. Because again, what I also recommend is not putting anything down below that you don't already have up here on top in some way at the main portion of the slide. Because you want, the only thing I would have an exception to is maybe like citations, which kind of take a lot of space sometimes on slides. And I would probably demote those into the notes as being something that's available if someone would like to have them, but they don't have to be up on the slide themselves. But I know some folks like to have the notations be up here because again, because of the outline view, they want to have that available for someone there too. But like I said, anyone can navigate through the sections of a PowerPoint by again using the Shift F4 and be able to jump around to each of the sections, or F6, I should say, to jump around to each of those sections as they need. And that will come in handy to something will come along later as we talk about alt text in a moment here. So any more questions though about text size so far or fonts? All right. Relating to text size, there's also emphasis. And this was one of those I think some people abuse. I have examples here of text in alt and italics that can be hard for some folks to read. This can impact some people who maybe have dyslexia and rely on the cues of letters being vertical rather than being angled from the baseline. Also, we have text that can be in all caps that can also be very hard to read. This again may affect those who are relying on the different shapes, the lowercase and the capital case of letters to understand what those words for. For those of us who work with government, this can also be a bad thing to use because a lot of what we do has acronyms. You know, you have government agencies that have like say DEA, the FAA, CIA, FBI, et cetera, that are rendered in all caps. And if you bury those in text that's also all capitalized, you kind of lose some of that inherent, at least visually, the emphasis they naturally have of being in all caps, you know, for the acronyms, I should say. And it, like I said, dilutes that. Another thing about all caps, which I think is still true on the internet, can anybody, if anybody's seen anyone who got a response in all caps, what does that typically convey? Exactly, you're being yelled at. Now, sometimes when we're doing our presentations, we might feel like yelling at our audience so they can understand what we're trying to tell them. It's probably not a good idea. So I would say don't do that. You know, we want to be kind, we want to be accepting, and sometimes you get more you attract more flies with vinegar than you do with honey than vinegar. I totally mangled that, sorry. But anyway, like I said, we don't want to be overdoing it with the all capitals because they have their place, like I said, in acronyms, and probably not anywhere else. Another thing that also can get confusing is if you use underlined text, especially within a PowerPoint presentation. Typically, in PowerPoint, if you have a link, it's going to be underlined. But some folks like to use underlining for emphasis. You know, this is a very important point, so I've underlined all this content. But again, if you have a link in the midst of that, that could get lost, and it might be hard. And again, that affects maybe more folks who have sight than those who are using assistive technology, because that would usually at least announce that there's a link there. Even visually, it may be hidden from view. But again, the underlining may be confusing for folks who are relying on that visual cue of the underlining to figure out where's the link and where is it not. And so you may be asking yourself, well, I've already knocked out 3 of the things I like to use. What's left? Well, you can use boldface, but I always recommend use it sparingly. One of my friends always used to say is that if everything is important, then nothing is important. So if you use boldface for the entirety of your entire slide, then really at that point, you're just going for visual points, not actually emphasis. You know, use it for the points that you actually want to highlight, at least not highlight, but at least emphasize with boldface text. But one thing to consider though is that boldface text is something that even the screen reader will not detect. Screen readers will not change that, will not say it stronger, or may not change the inflection of the voice in the screen reader to convey that. So that's why I always say, I recommend not using it for those kind of occasions either, because it may, if you're aware that your audience has someone who may be using a screen reader, the boldface would just totally pass by them. So I would recommend not using it in that case. But if you must, if you know your audience is probably going to be all sighted, maybe it's like your boss and they're sighted and you want them to give a message, maybe the boldface might be helpful in that kind of situation. But otherwise, I would just kind of lean back on it. Usually your words should be able to convey your point of view, your emphasis, rather than relying on the visual aspects.
How much I'm still learning.
Go ahead. I love the questions.
Actually, I have two things. One is
Mhm.
I do the same thing sparingly, but sometimes it feels like I'm telling them boldface is best used sparingly. You know?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm offending somebody then or not. Something we've done for the screen readers is in front of something where like sparingly could do it there. Especially for somebody that's using the presentation, is put a very teeny tiny font in front of it in a color that's not visually perceptive, so that the screen reader hears that there's a point being made here, even though but it's not distracting to the visual reader. So I don't know. My wife is blind, and we do a lot of, so
Mhm.
we've got that down.
Yeah.
It may not work for everybody,
Yeah.
but she was using it so much, I forgot I even started doing it with her. But
Yeah.
she likes the approach, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't bother anybody else.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you could do that. Although a little tiny bit helps whenever I'm looking at it. If it's white on white, then I have to go to other places to see it. Yeah. Whatever. For what
Yeah.
it's worth.
Yeah.
Right.
It's an interesting technique, but it does to me run into issues with contrast, because again, contrast has to have a certain level. And I tend to go with the idea of like your content should convey what you're trying to say, not so much the visual presentation of it. So maybe because my major was in English, so I kind of believe that words have value, especially with a PowerPoint presentation. And since words are text-based, I try to lean into that more than the visual aspects of that. But if that works for your wife, that's great. But it's, yeah, it could work. Yeah, but again, that's one of the things that goes back to the idea of testing. Make sure that the users that you're presenting this for, it's not something that, like you said, maybe an inconvenience. For some, it'd be perfect, may work just fine, but for some other ones, it may be an annoyance at best. So it's always good to test, no matter what you do. So, but that's good for all content, I think. So any other points or questions at this point? All right. Well, more things about the visual aspects of text is, for those of us that write and speak in English, we want to avoid using write justified text. Again, that disrupts the natural flow of how we expect language to, or English language and other Latin-based languages to be written. You know, it may be hard to read and process for someone maybe with dyslexia, because they're expecting that hard line to be on the right or the left instead of on the right. If maybe this was a language, they'll say like Arabic, that was, you know, starts from the right and then goes to the left, this might be totally fine. But the converse of having the being left justified for that particular audience would maybe be disruptive for them. So again, we want to be cognizant of, again, I'm speaking mostly to an American audience, or not an American audience, an audience that uses Latin-based languages. And so that's what my advice is for this one. So, but again, always be sure of your audience, because again, if you have an audience that has the language conveyed in a different way, we want to make sure we're respectful of that as well. And similar to that, you can have text that's fully justified, where it's you have the hard line on the right and the left. But this can also cause troubles for maybe some folks. Again, with dyslexia, they may be relying on the spaces between words to determine when one starts and one ends. For someone who may be using a screen magnifier, I don't know if you guys were at the legal up just now with Ron Lucy there. He was actually my boss when I was working at Texas HHS, and he actually happens to be someone who has has to have the use of a screen magnifier when he does his work. And something like this would probably drive him crazy because of the fact he kind of relies on the spaces between words to determine when one begins and one ends. Now, in this last line, we have the word some, S-O-M-E, but the spaces between each of the letters is much larger than some of the spaces we have above between particular words. And someone using a magnifier who's relying on that cue of figuring out where the spaces begin may get lost in that. And so that's one reason we can kind of avoid that situation, because maybe visually, maybe our business analyst is that we want this to look because it looks nice, but does it really help in the end? So I would say avoid those kind of things. Again, let the words be as they are, and that will help most folks, especially with those who have sight and rely on that to be able to discern what's going on. And kind of relating to that, this is something I've seen more recently. Vertically placed text. We have text that is placed on its side, so the hard line is either at the top or the bottom, but it's basically like you took your text and then knocked it over 90 degrees, either left or right. And you sometimes see this in graphs where people are trying to cram a lot of information and they say, well, the words are too long horizontally, so I'm going to turn the letters so I have a narrower span to fill in. Sometimes you see that with like charts and things of that nature. But again, it's very hard to convey, and someone would have to literally turn their screen to be able to see that, but some of our screens are very responsive to that kind of motion, and so they're going to have a game of catch-up where they're constantly turning the screen, and they'll never get to the point that they can read that easily because the computer tries to help them out by rotating on them, but it rotates into a way that's never helpful. So I would say just avoid that as best as anywhere you can. And finally, we come to images. Again, one of two. We want to avoid using images of text. And there are several things about that that make this very, very inaccessible. One of these is an example I have here, a large image of text of a phrase that says, this is an image of text. It's red text on a white background. But I enlarge this so that way we can see what happens when you magnify text like that that's in an image. It's very pixelated. Even those of us who can see it, and again, this is not, remind for those at home, this is a very large projected screen, about, again, 5 by 8 feet. The image itself apparently has about a 2 by 3 foot dimension, but even then it's still hard to read because of the pixelation that we have because of that. Again, someone using a magnifier across this image, this may be what they encounter, and it may be hard for them to figure out what's on there. And again, someone again with a cognitive disability, again, relying on the actual distinction of the shapes. This pixelation blurs all that and makes it very hard to figure out what's going on. So I would recommend not doing that. Another thing about images of text is that for creators, they're very time consuming. If say like I had a typo and I realized, oh, I used OV instead of OF for some reason, I need to go back in there, get my Illustrator, Photoshop, whatever it was I created this images, fix that image and correct that. That could take me maybe 5 minutes, but it's 5 minutes wasted that I could do. If it was actual text, I could get that done in a fraction of a time. It saves you much time if you do it that way. The other thing about images of text is that if you're going to use them on a website, and sometimes if you have a PowerPoint file that's say like on a public website and you have that available there for SEO purposes, that content won't be scanned at all. And likewise, if you were to take this PowerPoint and turn to a PDF, the content of this image would also not be taken at all because it's not text. It appears to be text, but it's not actual text. So for those technologies that rely on actual text, that's not there anymore. It's totally a visual thing, and that's what causes trouble there. And likewise, there's also a WCAG criteria that also kind of tells you not to use those anyway, because it causes all those problems. So we want to avoid that as best as we can. The other thing that we want to avoid, and thankfully this is something I have not seen in a while, and I hope I never see it again, but when I started doing my 20 years ago journey into accessibility, it was a common thing. We would have PowerPoint presentations that would flashing, blinking things. I remember I had a boss who said, I want to have this little fire gradient thing at the bottom of the slide because this is a hot topic. And I'm like, well, fire doesn't sound like a good idea anyway, but again, and this was back in 2005, so you had all these pixelated, if you think this is pixelated fire looks really weird. But again, that causes issues. It's distracting for someone maybe who has a cognitive issue. It may defer them, or rather, it may divert their attention from the meat of your content. And particularly for flashing items, depending on how quickly those items move, they could trigger epileptic seizures for folks with photosensitive epilepsy. And again, we don't want to harm our audience. Just because we want to convey something, we definitely don't want that to happen. And that's why I've never put an example of that on this slide, because I'm like, no, I do not want that to happen to anybody. I mean, that's the worst thing I think I could inflict on somebody via PowerPoint. So no go on that one. But again, thankfully, that's something that I have not seen, maybe COVID killed it, I don't know. But I haven't seen it as much as I did when I first started this. So thankfully, if you have anybody that you know that wants to do that, tell them not to do it, because it's harmful, I think. I think there was another presentation I talked about how barriers are harm. This, I think, is a prime example of that. We don't want to harm people physically, by triggering a bad episode for them. Now, our second slide about images, how do we do that? Well, the best way to do it is to use the Insert tab within PowerPoint to add the images. Sometimes folks will drag and drop, which is a functionality that Microsoft allows. But sometimes when it does that, it may drop that into again, the text box kind of smart art mechanism may kick in and may prevent the alt text from being added to it. So I always recommend to use the Insert tab. That way we can make sure it's precisely brought in, and then that way we can add the alt text. And this is the big thing that I know most folks have been talking about for PowerPoint. It's like, how do we add alt text images? Well, what we can do is we select the image. We'll get a pane that appears, or rather a contextual menu that appears. In that menu, we'll have an option that says Edit Alt Text. We'll select that one. The alt text pane will appear on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint window, and there is a field there where you can write in the description of that image. And one thing to remind you is if you have an image that says, if you have, what's the first thing I want to talk about here? Okay. You may be asking yourself, well, what if I have an image that doesn't really require alt text? It's purely decorative. You would probably mark it as decorative, but I would ask the question first before you even hit this button here about marking it as decorative. How would you determine if it is decorative or an informative image? Does anybody have any ideas? Anybody on Zoom? Okay, it's a bit of a stumper, but I'll simplify it for you. If you can take the image away and not lose any informative meaning to your presentation, it's probably decorative. If the image supplies some information that supports what you're talking about on your slide, it's probably informative and needs to have alt text. So that's kind of my rule of thumb for that. Again, if you can take it away and it doesn't impact your, what you're trying to convey, then you can probably take it away and mark it as decorative in that case. You could also make the case like, well, if you don't need it there, why even have it there at all? But that may be outside of your realm to make that choice. But at least you have that option there. The other thing also within the alt text pane is the option to generate a description for me. Now, Microsoft will help you out. Again, they're very helpful. They love to help. This is not a help. I've never seen anyone use this button and create an alt text that was descriptive really of what was there. Sometimes it gets close. Maybe if there's a picture of a person at a computer standing in front of a window, it'll say person at computer or person at window, but it leaves out the other half of that. And I guarantee you, any of you, especially if you're new to crafting alt text, because I consider it a craft, you'll be better than anything Microsoft is coming up with. Maybe in about 5 years, we'll see. But for right now, trust your instincts. Go with what you think. And more often you'll be right than Microsoft will be right in this case. So.
Especially if people they're given presentations,
Mhm.
say use this one. And it's like nothing is alt text, right? So I found rather than going through and doing the drop down menu to edit alt text, then go to the alt text, if you keep that open, you can go from slide to slide and start adding alt text, and it just keeps you from having to do one extra step. Just,
You got ahead of me on that one.
oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Like I said, I love it when folks are thinking ahead of me. So that's a very good tip right there. It will help you as a creator to get that done. Yeah, some of the techniques that I've discovered and other folks have discovered just because either by happenstance or they found a friend who just found that little nugget and they hung on to it and pass it on. That's why I think this whole class is it's a collection of nuggets that you guys can pass on to everyone. But that's one thing I love about also here at Access U. People will come with ideas that either I haven't heard of before, or may have only heard a couple of times, and I usually try to put it in and bring it out, like what you did just there. So that's always good to do that. One thing about alt text, and again, I call it a craft because it's not really a science, it's not really an art, it's a little of both. We want to be careful about how we do things. We want to consider the context of what that alt text is going to be. Again, what is the audience meant for? You know, that this image that you've decided is a decorative, or not a decorative, but an informative image. Who's the audience that's going to be seeing this? What does it support? What is the content, I should say, what is the content that the image is supporting? Again, if it's a meaningful image, what is it supporting on your slide? You know, what point is it trying to make or support in that case? And also what details of the image are relevant? Again, this kind of goes back to the content and also the audience that it's meant for. On this particular slide, slide 37, I have pictured Washington crossing the Delaware, the famous painting by Emanuel Leutze. I always get that name wrong, but I think I got it right that time. Leutze, he was the artist who painted this picture back, I think, in 1850. And depending on the context of this image, of how we're presenting it, the alt text might be a little different. I mean, at minimum, you're going to have the name of the title of the painting and identifying it as such, you know. But you may want to convey a little bit more. You may want to speak to, you know, why is this image here? Well, maybe this is an art class and we're talking about composition. And we could talk about how Leutze used composition, shapes, light, color to convey certain things. You may also want to talk about, maybe this is a class for, even though, well, now I'm going to say it, DEI, the bad word. It's got representation in this image. We have, of course, Washington and his generals next, or his subordinates, military subordinates there. We have a man apparently of Scottish descent because he's wearing a Scottish bonnet. Next to him is a man of African descent because he's dark skinned. And we have other men, maybe they're hunters, riflemen, a couple of apparently farmers. And again, this person in the back seems to be a man of, he's wearing indigenous clothing, moccasins, buckskin clothing. Maybe he's a Native American. You know, again, representation is put in this image. In this case, because this is about accessibility, I'm just telling you about what it is. So it is what it is. It's just a painting that can mean many things. But again, your alt text might be influenced by what you're trying to convey. So be kind of cognizant of those little details that might be helpful. Again, for DEI, representation, talking about those individuals in that picture would be important. In an art class, maybe not so much. So again, you can have the same picture and it would maybe be described different ways. Another thing to think about as well, even though a picture is worth 1,000 words, it shouldn't take you 1,000 words to describe that image. So what I would say is maybe make it very concise. You know, make sure that we have, you know, quickly, briefly define, you know, conveys what that image content is about. Be concise. Most screen readers can handle anywhere, I think it's about maybe at the max about 250 characters. But again, that might be a little bit of, again, information overload. We shouldn't have to be so worried to describe that image. But there is a special case for like complicated images like infographics and graphs and charts and things of the nature, which we'll get into that a little bit later. But again, try to be concise at the very least of what you're trying to describe in that image. One thing also we want to make sure is that we want to make sure that we do not have any kind of spelling errors. Because again, a screen reader will literally read what is being conveyed in that alt text field. So if, say, like you had a picture of a man from Brazil was your alt text, but you mistyped that as man from Brazil, well, you would think, well, this is a very powerful man. He can form a country. Well, because you translated or transliterated a little bit, a couple of characters, totally different meaning, which also relates to my final point here about not making sure that it will not be misunderstood or read aloud. Now, this might be, again, this is an actual trigger warning. This is a very serious concept I may come up with. But when I was at Job Corps, I was tasked with checking all the alt text for some of the images we had across all the Job Corps websites, and there were about 130 centers at the time. And one of them had a picture of a young woman sitting at a table with a book, and she was reading it. And the alt text was student reading about euthanasia. But the alt text sounded like that. What it was actually saying was student reading about youth, one word, in, second word. Third, Asia. It was a book about, I guess, high school students, or I guess they call it secondary school over there, of young people in school in the continent of Asia. We had to rewrite that, of course, because that sounded very different when read aloud. So we had to change that to student reading about young people in school in China or Africa, I mean, not Africa, Japan or something like that, something that was more appropriate. But that's one thing to consider. Whatever that's your alt text is thinking about, I always say, if you're not sure, have someone else read it for you or speak it aloud. Sometimes even yourself saying it aloud may trigger that, oh, somebody might take that the wrong way. But I usually just have somebody else read it with you, like read it to them. And if they look at you a little funny, maybe threaten to call HR, you probably want to rewrite that. So again, we want to make sure that we're understood even in our alt text and what we do. So any questions on alt text? I know it's kind of a deep topic. All right, well, let's go ahead and look at an exercise real quickly. And after that, we'll take a break. Because like I said, this is a very deep topic. And we'll go to inserting an image. So in this case, I have my placeholder here. I'm going to insert an image to it. So I'm going to go up to the ribbon, go to the insert option up there. That brings up the ribbon. I'm going to go ahead and select that image. I'm going to save from this device because I have it local. And why did it? Oh, went to the wrong place. Don't you like it how OneDrive tries to really assert itself to you? I thought I had prepped this already, but it did not. So I'm going to get my image, insert that in there. Therefore, all right. For those of us who can see it, who wants to suggest an alt text for this one? If you have an idea, let us know so we can put it up on the mic, if you're feeling brave. All right, we got a taker. Before you say it though, I'm going to bring up the alt text. Again, selected the image, bring up the contextual menu, selecting the option view alt text. And let me bring this over here so we can see that alt text view. And I'm your servant. What is your alt text?
Meme of Bill Murray pointing with the text, "You're awesome."
Pardon my poor typing. It always gets worse when people are looking. I think there's got to be a psychological name for that, right? But that is actually very good. You've added something I've never heard anyone mention before, is you added the meme, which is a very important thing to note in this particular image, because it is a meme of that, which you precisely described. Most people I would accept just, of Bill Murray pointing at the screen with the text, "You're awesome." And I know I left something out, so let me make sure I get that all in there. But that is a very complete alt text, I think, to describe this particular image. I know in years past, I had someone also mention that maybe identify Bill Murray as an actor, because there may be people who they may recognize the name, but they're like, I don't know who he is. Is he a singer? Is he a comedian? In this case, we could say an actor or a comedian, because he did both. But you did get the main points. Well, I'm going to own the pun of him pointing. You said at the screen? Okay, I'll go with that. Okay. So right there, very complete alt text, very brief. Back in the old days when people used to tweet a lot, I would usually tell people just make it no bigger than a tweet. That's usually about the right size, even when it was 140 and now it's like 350 or whatever it is now. But that's very concise, sums up everything that's in the image in a very nice, concise way. And again, for those of us who can't see it, I think it's a pretty good way to describe what's on there. And again, since this is decorative, we're not excuse me, we're not going to have it generate alt text. Like I said, Microsoft would not do as good a job as what you just did there. So I applaud you for that. And I think we have somebody on Zoom that's asking a question. Deb? All right. Can you bring them up?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I don't know if I can hear them.
My organization sent screenshots of our websites and the PowerPoint to show.
You can't hear me?
Further, she said for times where it's not a live demo or as a backup, if live demo isn't working, is there a different approach that's more accessible?
That's a very good question. Again, it goes back to what you're trying to convey with those screenshots. Is it screenshots of the process on the website? Maybe it's like an application process for that. Or if it's a demo of, say, a particular screen, say like like this is how you sign up for our program, or, if it's a government program, how do you sign up for that? How, what are the fields? And then for that thing, you would describe what's on that. Like, again, if it's a form, you would say, this is the form where you would fill in your personal information. Say like if it's a credit card loan, add in your social security number, things of that nature. Again, whatever's pictured, but that's also very dense. So I would probably recommend maybe a smaller one. And again, it kind of depends on what's going on. If it's just more like a sample of this is what our interface looks like, maybe describing every single little square and every little pixel might be a little overdone, but you may say, compared to our old one, this is what this looks like. Maybe it uses certain colors more. And that is a case where you probably want to introduce the idea of colors or maybe shapes, but you don't want to rely on that as being the main cause. You maybe just say, this is our new interface. These are the new features that we've added to it, and maybe speak to more of the functions that are on that, not so much the look and feel. Because again, that's a word that we hear a lot with websites. Maybe we want to say about the functionality. Maybe this has a search bar that's up at the top that's easier for people to locate rather than before where it was maybe off to the side or something like that. Again, it depends on the content of the screenshot, but it's a very good question though right there. And are there any other questions out there? Hopefully I answered that one sufficiently. All right, looks like we've gotten it. So I'm going to let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. Like I said, we're kind of about midway through. So let's see, we're at 3:52. So let's come back at about 4:02. Okay, then. Let's go ahead and resume our conversation about alt text. In this case, we're going to talk about charts and graphs. And these are probably one of the more complicated things we're going to have to deal with, especially with PowerPoint. If anything is kind of almost a native thing that we use PowerPoint for, typically, aside from conveying information with list items, it's going to be showing things in graph form. As we talked about earlier, there are placeholder layouts or content placeholders that can accept graphs natively, but I recommend that you use them as images because it's a little easier to deal with. Again, going with the mechanism that Microsoft uses to embed graphics and graphs, it's akin to the smart art discussion we had earlier, how some of that can be a little inaccessible. Sometimes in that case, though, it tends to render a lot of information. Like for those who can see this particular example on this slide, on slide 40, this is a complicated example I got from Google a while back. I asked them for a complex graph, and I got that. In this case, we have a graph that has 3 axes rather than just the normal 2, X and Y. We have on the X-axis, it goes from 0 to 400. On the left hand, there is a Y-axis that goes from 0 to 50. On the right-hand side of the graph, we have another axis that goes on the Y-axis that goes from 0 to 30. Very complicated. I have no understanding why they did it that way, but in addition to all that, we also have a couple of plot points on it. One is done with diamonds, one is done with stars, and they're charting various data points on that. We also have 2 sets of bar graphs on there, or rather bars, dictating, again, another set of data values on there. One appears to be a range coming from 0 and going to different values. One seems to start at 25, and then the bottom points are very much also varied and end up in varying top points as well. Again, it's a very complicated graph. I would say this one could easily be divided out into 4 graphs to define everything a little easier. I'm still not clear on why it has 2 y-axes with 2 different values that apparently do end at the same top level. The 30 and the 50 do seem to be equivalent on this on the top level of this, the top boundary of this graph. Why those two values are equal, I have no idea. And I don't really know what you refer to. So this is about as complicated as a graph you could ever find. But again, something like this, we want to make sure that this is again a very extreme example, but I know I've come across a few in my time that have rivaled this one in terms of their complexity and lack of understanding. Again, with everything I've discussed so far, if you don't take anything else, we want to make sure that what we're doing with PowerPoint is that we convey stuff for people to understand. And a graph like this obviously does not do that. It fails miserably at that attempt. So, like I said, keep graphs simple. Make them as simple as you can. Again, something like this, I would probably divide it out, like I said, into 4 different graphs and then set them up so that way each of those is very easier to digest and understand. But for any graph, even for a simple one, when we talk about alt text, we want to make sure that we provide detailed information about what it conveys. And then even a simple graph can be very hard to describe. Again, it goes back to the idea of how do we convey everything so someone who can't see it gets that same information. Again, that equal access. So what you can do is provide it in several ways. We can provide a separate alternative accessible resource that does the same information as the graph itself. This could be maybe a graph or a table, either an Excel file that's been linked to it, maybe a web page that also has a graph also on that website. So that way, or rather, has a table that's done with a native HTML, so we can have that built-in accessibility that we get when tables are done properly. And that might provide that information of all the data points we have here. So we don't have to really stuff all that information into the alt text itself. We provide a way for someone to get to that. Another thing you do, at least in the context of PowerPoint, we can also provide that detailed information in the notes section, or we could provide it on the slide itself. And let me expand this so I can show that a little bit bigger here. For the folks at home, again, we want to make sure we always provide alt text, but again, we don't want to overload the alt text we're using here. So what we can do, there's 2 methods we can do to provide that description for a graph. First off, we will have alt text with a short description of what that graph is about in the alt text pane that we have within PowerPoint. And then we can end that alt text phrasing, say like typically somebody had asked earlier about the question about captioning that might be accompanying a graph. It's not really helpful to duplicate information that way. So it's okay to have that information appear on the slide, but we can probably sum up the title, so to speak, of this graph in the alt text. So if say I give us a graph about, trying to think of something real quick. Oh, what was your example? Maybe that might help me a little bit. Oh, okay, I thought you had one. Mhm.
Because I don't want to be redundant.
Right.
You know, there's give a little bit of caption and then it seems to be, I seem to be putting the same thing, maybe a little tweak here and there in the alt text.
Right. Yeah, for something like that, like I said, we would try to at least get the basic gist, I guess you could say, a quick summation of what the graph is about. And again, we're going to go look at a couple examples here shortly, but again, put that quick description there. If you have a caption, try not to duplicate that within the alt text. We want to make sure that's somewhat unique content, so we can. I would think a caption to a graph would basically be more like a supporting element to it, not actually part of the description in and of itself. But even though we do see documents, well, let's say like figure A, graph of, a trend over time, something like that. And that might be duplicated within the alt text. You might want to say in the alt text that you may not want to repeat where it says figure A because you already have that in the caption, but maybe something that's a slightly different take of the same information. So you're not literally repeating that information twice that closely together. Again, it's kind of hard to say without an actual concrete example, but we'll look at that in just a moment. Maybe something like that will come up into mind when we get to the exercises in just a moment. But anyway, for this a method, getting back to it, we're putting the description that fully describes this graphic in the notes section of that slide itself. That way, if someone wants that information, say like if it's a lot of data sets and they might be the kind of person that really likes to crunch numbers, they'll have that information available to them there within the context of the notes on that slide itself. Another method is to apply that description within the slide itself on another content placeholder. And on this particular slide, we have an example of that where I've taken a simple chart from the Social Security Administration. It's showing 3 lines with an axis of, on the x-axis of 0 to 100, and actually on both y and x. The y-axis is the cumulative percentage of total lifetime benefits received. The x-axis is the cumulative percentage of total lifetime payroll taxes paid. And the lines that we have here are discussing the flat dollar benefit, Social Security, and a DC plan with no redistribution. Not sure what that means, but that's what it has pictured on the slide itself. But the description of the slide, or rather of this graph, we put that full detailed description on a different placeholder in the same slide, so we can basically visually hide it behind the slide itself. So in this example, on this particular slide that we're looking at here, on slide 42, I have it kind of partially uncovered, so you can kind of see where it's going to be hidden beneath view. So when someone looks at it with sight, they'll just see the graph in and of itself. Someone will encounter this with a screen reader. Again, because this is part of a placeholder that will appear in the outline view, they'll have all that information available to them there. But when they navigate to the slide or to the image itself, it'll say alt text describing this particular image. For full description of this image, please see the description elsewhere on this slide. Again, we're telling them where to get that full description from on the slide itself. And again, we can either hide that content placeholder, as we discussed earlier with that option where we can make it invisible, or we can just physically hide it beneath or behind the image itself of the graph. And just to let you know, I did not write the alt text for this particular example. This was taken from the actual Social Security Administration website, ssa.gov, where I found this example, and that was a description. They actually had that alt text on a link on another page. So when you came across this link, it would say, I think on that particular example, because it was on a website, it said full description of this graph is available on the link after this particular image. And then it had a link below that said, full description, please see the link, or the link would lead you there. Not in so many words, but in a way that made sense, accessibly. So, and if anybody has to do with data, it's going to be the Social Security Administration. And again, this for those of us that can see, it seems like a very simple graph, 3 lines, but as you can see the text peeking out from behind it, it's a very dense, informationally dense image to convey everything that is being depicted on it. So again, infographics kind of fall, I don't have an example on this presentation, but it falls in the same way. Whatever you convey visually, we want to make sure that we convey that information in a way that people who can't see it, had the benefit of understanding those details. And so the description method of either putting it on the notes section or on the slide itself, either of those will work for those cases as well. So any questions about that? We'll go into some exercises though about that in a moment. All right then, let me go ahead and go back to our exercise file. Okay, and since again, these are very simple seeming graphics, this was not going to be so much as me demoing them directly, but showing you exactly what I kind of came up with. Here we have a graph that shows some monthly pet expenses. One is for Hans the dog and one is for Edison the cat. And for the month, we have different values of food, toys, and healthcare that was spent for each of these 2 little lovely animals. So for this one, in the notes, I went ahead and wrote that in. We have food expenses, $50 for Hans the dog, $30 for Edison the cat. Toy expenses, $5 for Hans the dog, $10 for Edison the cat. And for healthcare expenses, we had $20 for Hans the dog and $40 for Edison. So again, we put this description down there. But again, that's the full description of the data. But for the alt text, kind of what we discussed so far, we have bar graph showing monthly pet expenses, and the full description can be found. This I actually will write in this case in the notes section. Oops. Again, we've told the person using a screen reader where they can find that full description, because we put it up here, the general description of what is the bar graph showing the monthly expenses, but the full description can be found in the notes section down at the bottom. And again, being that is text-based, just like the outline view, that information is available to someone using a screen reader. Now, an alternate method to this concept is we can do the same thing there. But, and let me move this a little bit more. Actually, let me bring up the selection pane. And let me just hide the actual image for now so you can read that. Again, we have the same information we had in that note slide, or the slide earlier, the food expenses and the amounts for each pet. And we have that on the content placeholder. And again, I'm making this revisible so I can show you can do one or two things. I can either make the placeholder that's holding that information, that textual information about the details of those of the chart. In the selection pane, I can hide it visually. And again, it's still available in the outline view, if you notice here on the left-hand side, or I can make it visible, but move the actual image of the graph over the placeholder. And that way it's hidden visually, but in either way, it's still available in the outline view. If you see over here on the left-hand side, we have that information there. And again, depending on the audience, you may think this might be a little verbose, or maybe this might be helpful for them. And again, if you were kind of creating this for someone who maybe creating a Braille version for someone, this is probably the one I would recommend of the two, because that way that outputs directly. Otherwise, you'd have to copy and paste everything from the notes view. But again, it kind of depends on the audience and what you think they might be, if they're really into the details, that might work better for them, for a general audience. But again, if it's not, maybe you think only a few may require that, you can probably fork this, create a copy of this, and then make that for the Braille view, and then use the other method for an audience where maybe just hiding it would be enough, and that way they could accept that information there via the notes. Question? I'm sorry. Yeah.
So as long as it's in the left-hand panel, correct?
Yeah.
The description and breakdown, the screen reader will read that.
Yes, exactly. The outline view is text-based.
So to put it in the notes would be redundant to do.
To do both, yes. If you did both methods, that would be
Okay.
redundant. You could
There-
use one or the other.
Okay, so
Becau-
there's no problem with a screen reader ever reading what's in that notes area. They have
Exactly.
total access to that.
Yes, because the notes is also text-based as well.
Okay,
It's just that someone using a screen reader would have to use Shift FH to get from here and here, just a couple extra steps. But again, the information is available for them.
okay. And what about the text you were saying, if it was in the select view behind the image? How does it read that? Because
way-
it's in the, because
Because it's in the
left-hand-
outline view.
Okay,
Again, we
gotcha.
haven't removed it from the slide. It's there as a content placeholder.
Okay, thank you. That
Yeah.
clears it up.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
I appreciate that because it can be a little confusing for things like this, but I'm happy to dwell on points to make sure that you guys understand. Because like I said, my thing is for PowerPoint, we want to make sure we have our understanding straight. So any other questions on these two methods? Anything online? Okay, all right. Let's get out of here, get back to our main presentation. And we'll go to another topic that comes up with PowerPoint that we see or hear often enough, is about color. I mean, typically people rely on the visual aspects, and color is one of those big creative aspects that you find within PowerPoints. Many people dwell a lot on just even the style of colors they're going to use just for the backgrounds. But one thing to always keep in mind, we don't want to rely on color alone to convey any kind of information. Again, if you have any content that maybe is in a background, we want to make sure that's available as text again. So if we can't have the benefit of sight, that information gets lost. And likewise here, I have an example here of a chart that was to test for color blindness here. And there are actually 12 squares on this one. They have each a at least a two-digit number in each of them. And out of all of these, I think I can only detect 2 of them. Again, because it's kind of hard to see. If someone maybe who has color blindness, maybe all of these would be very hard to tell. They may not even tell that they were numbers here, just because of the way the colors that are used here. So we don't want to rely on color as being the only way of conveying information. Not that we can't use color, but color should be a secondary at the most way of conveying information. And here's one example, or rather a couple of examples of this. If we're relying more often than not, we see the color red to note something of significance. But again, with red and black, that can be problematic. For some folks with color blindness, the red can be read as kind of a dark gray. And so even that dark gray with that black may be hard to discern which is which. So in this version, we have pictured a list of readings for, I'm assuming, a college class, where the required readings are noted in red. And we look at them in full color, and we also have an example of that same listing as someone maybe who had color blindness and have how they would see that. In this case, the distinction between the two is hard to make, again, on sight alone. The second example is a better one. We do have the colors, again, advising it, but we have another thing that we've added to it as asterisks. Those can be read by a screen reader because it's a character that's available as text. And we also have a note saying noted with asterisks. We can't just rely on the existence of asterisks alone because asterisks can have different meanings. So in this case, the ones that are going to be required for this class are chapters 1, 2, 3, and 5. 4 is the one that we're allowed to miss for this particular class. However, again, if we had only rely on color, the color red, to denote those chapters, if I was colorblind, I would probably read all 5 thinking, well, I don't know which it is. I better make sure I get them all. Conversely, with asterisks, I tend to view asterisks as being exceptions. So even if they didn't have the note saying noted with asterisks, I might think the asterisks are the ones I'm not supposed to read, even though there's red. And I think, well, I'm just going to read chapter 4. It's the only one that doesn't have the exception on it. But the note that says noted with asterisks makes it very clear. If it has an asterisk, I have to read it. So again, we want to make sure we're not just relying on color or visual aspects to let people know what's going on. Again, we want to make sure we're totally understood. Similar to that in financial circles, we have negative numbers that are sometimes displayed with red. You know, the phrase that people say, we're in the red, we're in the negative. If you have in this example, we have on the left-hand slide, on slide 46, a kind of a sample from looks like an Excel spreadsheet, and there is a couple of values that are negative. They're being only indicated though with the color red, again, like the previous example. Again, if I couldn't see that in color, I might miss out on that. On this second version of that same particular spreadsheet, we have those numbers denoted also with red, but with parenthesis, which is a common nomenclature for negative numbers in financial fields. Sometimes you can also have a negative hyphen or something in front of it to note that as well. But either way, those are both text-based methods. In this case, they used red, but I made this one purposely in grayscale so you can kind of see that it's still visible to understand what's going on because I'm using a text-based characteristics rather than just color alone to display that these are negative values in this case. In this case, the ones that are negative values were the ones in rows 2 and 6 on these particular pictures that we have on screen. And also for color, we can use that to, we may have issues with that when we use them with line graphs. In this case, we have lines with identical styles, in this case, solid color lines, but they may be hard to process again. In the first example, we have some sandwiches at a cafe. We have tuna, ham, and cucumber. The tuna represented by a red line, ham is represented by a solid blue line, and then the cucumber is a solid green line. And again, these are all solid lines. If we take color away, though, from that, in the second screenshot we have here, in a grayscale, they all seem like varying shades of gray. And because they're solid, it's hard to determine which sandwich type is which, because we're relying on color alone to determine that. So we want to use different ways to convey that. And one way we can do that is use just different styles in terms of patterns. In this improved version, we now have the full color version. The tuna, again, is a solid red line, but the ham is a series of blue little dots in series. And then the green line for the cucumber is more of a dotted line. So there's longer spans. So it's not a totally uninterrupted solid line. There is some separation. And then if we convert that to grayscale, this again is a little easier to understand. If we not rely on color alone, we're relying on the styles. And even without the color, we can still discern which is the ham sandwiches, the tuna sandwiches, and the cucumber sandwiches. Because again, we're relying on the styles to help us out in this particular way. And similarly, we can also do that with bar graphs. Again, we're using patterns to differentiate between these two. Again, we're using a kind of a problematic combination of red and black adjacent to each other. But in the second example, rather than the solid colors of red and black to represent, in this case, plants and no plants of end of year math results, we have some that are, in this case, the ones that had the red color have kind of a cross-hatched diamond pattern, whereas the ones with the black background have kind of a striped pattern with the gray and the black. And again, if we were to take color away from this, the patterns alone would help us discern which is which of these two values here on these graphs. So again, we're not relying on color as the main way to get things across. We're using some alternative means to get that task done. And again, we were speaking about color alone, which is a slightly different topic from contrast. I know sometimes people get those confused. Contrast just really speaks to the way how we can determine the text of a color, or rather the contrast between color used for text and the color of the background it appears on. In this case, we have two examples. We have the same phrase, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, in white text, but on one of them, it's on a dark purple background, whereas the second one has it on a striped background with a lot of pastel colors, some light blue, some lavender, some orange, which against that white text is very hard to read. It's, you know, again, the contrast is not high enough, and it makes it hard to discern. So a quick way to kind of figure out what you're working with, you could just use a plain solid color background. This also works for like images as well. I remember one time I was working on a website and they had, again, white text on a background of, say, a sky full of clouds. Well, on the blue background of the sky, it wasn't too bad. But on the clouds, the white color just washed away and it was hard to see what was going on. So again, if we try to stay away from kind of photographic or multicolored backgrounds with a light color text, we want to make sure that we're done right. But we can also check this in a more precise way. We can use color contrast tools. In this case, this is the one I've pretty much used throughout my career. It's a standalone application called Color Contrast Analyzer. I believe it was created by a group out of Australia, which is why it has the British spelling with the COLUR and analyzer with the S instead of the Z. But this is a very a good tool. One of the good things about this tool is you can use it for any application. It's commonly used, like I said, in web applications because you can sample, as it were, with like it has an an eyedropper interface where you can sample colors directly from your choices that you're using, the color of your text, the color of your background. Even though it has one called foreground and one called background, you can switch these two. As long as you have your combination of colors precisely picked, you can determine whether that's a good combination or not. In this case, we have the background color is white. The foreground color is kind of a greenish yellow color, maybe goldish. The other good thing about this tool is that if you have a hex code available, rather than having kind of a somewhat precise way of picking colors with the eyedropper, you can, if you know the hex codes, you can actually type those in directly. And especially if you're creating something for a website, that's very helpful because most time developers will use that to, you know, define their style sheets, etc., for the colors they're going to be using. So you can discern those combinations that way. In this case, this combination of that gold color against the white fails. In this case, it also tells you about the WCAG criteria it would fail under. There's an advanced one, which is the AAA, which a lot of places don't really go for, but I recommend trying to go for that in too, because I would say if you can get 3 green check marks, you're in the best space you can be in terms of color contrast. But at the very minimum, though, typically you want to go with the color contrast, the first one here being the contrast minimum. Most organizations require that. If you have organizations that's using WCAG 2.1, there's also an additional criterion that speaks to non-text contrast, and that more applies to UI components and graphical objects, which we typically don't see in PowerPoint as much as we do in the web realm. So I usually don't pay attention as much as this for PowerPoint use. This is the one I tend to look at more to figure it out, because this tool will show you all of the 3 of those by default. So again, for those of us that are just strictly PowerPoint, this is the one I would focus more. If you were in web design, then I would look at the other 2. But of course, that would be a different job description for that. So any questions on this one here? All right. And again, this is also a free download, provided your company allows you to load it, because again, sometimes installs on your computer may be something they frown upon. But I know in my company at Citi, they do have a package that they have already vetted for us and they install it for us. So we get it, but we have to go an extra step because they've already secured it or vetted it for security in that respect. All right, so let's go to our fifth example here, or rather exercise. And we'll look at color contrast here. And let me fire up my instance of the analyzer. And I have a lot of stuff on my screen, so let me try to resize this so it's a little more visible. The one thing about the color contrast analyzer, it supersedes anything except for zoom. So you can see how it's covering up everything on the screen there. So make sure it's off screen so we can see it. Okay. So we have three examples here of color on various backgrounds. When we have a yellow text on a purple background, we have green text on a white background, and red text on a black background. Now, if those of you can see this, of the first one with the yellow text on the purple background, do you think that would pass or do you think that would fail for contrast? Show of hands, do you think it will pass? So we have about half of the people in the room. All right, let's test it. Let's see what it does. And again, it doesn't really matter in terms of the foreground background, just as long as you have one distinct from the other. So I'm just going to select foreground as the purple one, and I'm going to select the yellow as my background. And this one does pass. And in fact, it passes all three criterion. So if I was going to use this on a website, that'd be great. So for folks at LSU, they've got a good combo because their school colors are yellow and purple for those that don't know. All right, let's go look at the second example. This is the green text on the white background. Show of hands, who thinks this is going to pass? I'm seeing a large amount of hands, actually no hands, saying that it will pass. So let's double check to be sure. All right, select the white. Again, if I had used yellow and white, it would fail. So that's one good thing about this thing. It will save color, so you can kind of test another combo at the same time. But strictly speaking, we're going to look at blue, I mean not blue, green and white. And yes, it did fail miserably all across the board. Those of you who had your hands held down, you were correct. Let's look at our last example here. This is the red text on the black background. Once again, who thinks this will pass and who thinks it will pass? Once again, the hands are down. Let's test to be sure. This one, sorta. This is one thing I didn't mention, but precisely because of this, because I didn't want to tip my hand. This fails for regular text. In other words, text, there is a criterion that's very precise about the point size. For PowerPoint, that would typically be anything smaller than, I believe it's 16 point font or smaller. This would fail because it's too small. Contrast is too low for that small of a text size. But if you had larger text, this would pass. So for this one, I would check to see what size text I'm using. And if we look up here at the very top, I'm using Verdana and 44. So this would actually pass because it is a large font size. And this is also the reason why I recommended using larger fonts in terms of color. If you have a color that's kind of, again, like this one on the fence, it may fail for smaller. If you go bigger, it will more likely pass. And with 24, it will probably pass this one as well, because again, it's not, 24 is not considered a small size in terms of the criteria of this particular web content accessibility guidelines. This would not fail under 24 size font. Anything smaller than 16. And typically in PowerPoint, you're not going to be really working with that small color combination for that small. For this particular color combination, you're not going to work with that small size anyway. So you'll probably pass more often than not. But again, it's always helpful to check just to be sure.
I mean, darker.
Well, if I change it darker, will it actually pass though? Remember, this is a black background. If you're making it darker on dark, it may actually fail because that's okay. That's all right. I appreciate the effort. No problem. But again, that's why it's always helpful that, we can rely on some guessing, but it's always better. I mean, it is better to test, just test to be sure. Again, we want to be accurate about what we're doing. So, and my analyzer didn't like me. I guess I need to update it. All right, let's go back to our presentation here. Now, one thing I think some folks may have already been aware of, that there is an accessibility checker within PowerPoint. Up until a few years ago, I did not recommend it because in Microsoft's infinite wisdom, it tended to give you information that was either not helpful or even wrong, or it would apply to things that really made no difference. You know, it would speak to errors that had no meaning within the terms of a PowerPoint. In the context of PowerPoint, it had no meaning. But I'm happy to say that in the last couple of years, I probably say after COVID, maybe that's what made them improve it. It got better. And there's actually things, one thing I really like about it that we can use it for now that was actually a lot more complicated otherwise if we didn't have the checker. So to get to there though, let's go ahead and look at that. What you would do is you go to the ribbon, go to the review tab, go to the comments go to the accessibility section and click on check accessibility. And then that would bring up a pane again on the right-hand side next to where the main window of the PowerPoint file would be, and it would be called accessibility. And that's where your issues, if you had any, would be displayed within that. And we'll look at a few examples of that there. Out of the way. And this may vary depending on what version you're using. This is from 2021 version last year. They've actually updated within the last couple of months, so it doesn't quite look the same, but the information is still identical. 365 also looks very similar to this as well. So it depends on what version you're using, but the information it gives you is very similar to this. What it can actually detect, and I think very well, it can certainly detect if you're missing instances of alt text. It will let you know, typically it'll say a message like missing object description. Description should be a clue to let you know that there's alt text missing for images, which is very helpful because that's a very tedious process to go through each image and make sure that you have alt text or not for anything that's meaningful. Also, it will look for, as I talked to earlier about auto-generated alt text. If you click that button or maybe somebody had before you got a hold of the file and tried to get some help from Microsoft, even Microsoft doesn't quite trust it. So it'll let you know, well, there's a couple of these that have auto-generated description. We need to check it out, make sure it's right. And more often than not, you'll probably have to make an adjustment to it. So it does tell you that for sure. One thing, even though we went through a manual process earlier, it's very good at finding duplicate sites. So that's become a lot less tedious process. I wanted you to be aware though of the outline view because of what the other things you can do with it, not just for looking for the duplicate sites, but this is a very helpful way of finding those as well. And also the most important thing that I like about what it does now, which does really well, which was a very convoluted process before, was verifying your reading order within a slide. Now for reading order, typically when you have a slide, you have various objects. And again, we've already talked about that before with the content placeholder. You may have pictures, things of that nature. This will display what the reading order of that is. And typically you want it to read starting with your title, because that's typically the first thing someone will encounter using the screen reader for your slide. And then whatever you want it to have next. Logically, typically we go from left to right. There may be instances you want to maybe go to the image first rather than the text, like we have in this example. But again, as long as you read the page title first, typically that's your first good start. That's almost always going to be the first thing you're going to encounter. And again, the natural flow of a page. Typically we read left to right, so you want to encounter the next thing should be the leftmost thing below the title, and then whatever comes next to it. And then again, this simple example only has 3 objects. We have a title, we have a content placeholder that contains some text, and we have a title on that. And it numbers them for you. So in this instance, the number 1 item in the reading order is the content placeholder, where it says the good, the bad, the ugly. But it's not the title. The title of this is actually checking the reading order, but if you look at the reading order pane, it's 3rd. So right there, that's obviously extremely out of order. And then finally, what it has listed as 2nd is a montage of the actors from that movie, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And it's one of my favorite ones, that's why I put it there. So anyway, again, we do see the good and the bad and the ugly of this particular example here. We know what things are. We see it's bad because it's all out of order. And then the ugly is that, well, we got to fix it. The good thing about it, though, we can actually drag and drop each of these and put them in the correct order as we need. So in this case, on the title, right now it's currently 3rd. We can drag and drop it, move it up so it's in the number 1 slot. the content placeholder that's currently that, we can move that down. It will automatically kind of adjust these as well as you move things around. So if we move that to the very top, that may shift the other two down in the appropriate place. But if it doesn't, again, if you have multiple content placeholders, you'll need to adjust that as well. One thing you can also do, if you're using the keyboard, you can actually select one of these items and then use one of these two buttons here, navigate to those, the up and down one, and move it up and down navigate it up and down within the listing to get into the proper place. And again, if you're a content, rather, if you're someone who creates content in PowerPoint using the keyboard or if you're using the screen reader, those two buttons, again, you could do it that way as well. For those of us who have sight and have the ability to navigate with a mouse, maybe the drag and drop method might be a little more helpful. So again, this is one of those things where Microsoft has really helped us out in a way to fix that. If we do have bonus time, we may get into, I'll show you the old fashioned way, which is kind of a mind flip. But for now, any questions on this process? Yes, over here. The more the merrier.
So show the, like anything that we have hidden, like for the screen reader specifically?
Yes.
And does it also show, so in the case where someone just chooses the title slide and they add their own content without the actual placeholders, does it list those out?
Yeah, it will list those as well. But if you have something hidden, it will not appear in the reading order because you've basically taken it out of the view.
Okay, that was my next question as
Okay,
well.
yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
I appreciate the subtlety on it because there are very subtle points about that to be sure. Now, the previous way of doing this was done using that selection pane, and that would impact how we would do things. But again, it was a very convoluted process. The main thing about that, just to save you the misery of it, is that it was actually inverted. So what was at the bottom was the top, and what was the top was the bottom. For a lot, and that's why I call it a mind flip. You had to figure out that to make sense of it. And for a lot of people, that was a lot more confusing than it had. And like I said, I'm very thankful that Microsoft finally figured out a way to get this thing that makes sense. It's intuitive for people. Reading order should be whatever's on the top is number one, whatever's at the bottom is the last. And thankfully, with this particular reading order pane, they've accomplished that. And that's, I think, probably one of the best things they've done with the accessibility checker. Again, I don't endorse it 100%, but they did get this right, which was probably one of the worst things they had before. So I think they've saved a lot of people grief with this new method they've done. All right, so with that, let's go back. Oh, another question. There is a Zoom question. Okay. Just want to be sure. Oh, yeah, one more over here.
Specifically with the accessibility checker, is there anything that it does not check? That is a very common mistake people make.
Yes. You're looking at it right there.
The color contrast.
Well, for those of us who can see, the color contrast. It's not very reliable. And part of the problem is, with this particular example where I have the green with the white background, it's only detecting this because I explicitly told it in this placeholder a white background. If I had removed that and say the background of the slide was black, you would have black on or green on black, and it would still say it was fine because it doesn't detect background elements at all. So it would theoretically pass this, but if anyone would tested it with the checker or with their own eyes, it would obviously fail with that green and the black because it would not be enough. And that's one of the things I don't, even though the checker may show you errors about contrast, and I would say maybe about 40% of the, well, actually, no, I'd say about 60% of the time it's probably right. It's not 100%. And I'd rather you guys use the more manual method to make sure things are done the right way. Again, that's true, but some people like to be colorful. So, but again, thanks for the good question about that because you led me right into this. There's also a couple other things that it does, which I can't even think of offhand, but I know this is one of the biggest ones right there with the color contrast. It's not that reliable to say that you can use its results as being absolutely correct, or at least for this particular thing. For everything else that I discussed on that particular slide that I mentioned, it's 100%. Trust those results, especially with the reading order. That's always something that people don't even realize that's a thing, but it's a major issue. And they've really fixed it in a way that makes sense. So let's go back to our slide here. And, oh, this kind of describes already what I was talking about here with the selection pane. Again, with the selection pane, what was upside down, or rather, this was in counterintuitive order. So even though it appears that the title was correct, being at the top of the list, it was actually at the bottom. And this would actually fail. So if I run the checker on here, which I will do from the review in the ribbon, click on check accessibility. And I guess I fixed this one. Oh, I did fix it. So yay, I got it right, but I didn't mean to do it that way. Well, let me totally correct this then. All right. Let me save. Now let me go to review. Oh, that's another thing it does sometimes. If you run the checker and sometimes like you did something wrong and you passed it the first time and then like I did just now and undid it, it'll still say it's fine. That's another thing. I totally forgot about that. It does that sometimes. So I always recommend if you're going to run the accessibility checker, do it at the absolute end after you've done anything else on your document. If your content's finalized, the graphics, the colors have all been chosen, the alt text that you assume is there is fine, because once you fix something and then you undo it in the same instance, you'd have to shut this thing down and start it up again. So that way we get that second time around. In fact, let me try that right now. And that can throw some folks off if it's not done. Nope, it's still saying it's right, even though it's wrong. So yeah. So again, that's my caveats about it. It's like it's good, but you have to realize where the limits of its good is at the moment. So, but had it been wrong, it would have listed that here. And you can see it's slightly different from the screenshot I had earlier because they've updated it earlier this year. And had it been an issue, it would have listed as check reading order. And then you would go there and it would show the listings of the available items that were out of order. And then you could go there directly and then reorder them as we saw on the previous slide, by dragging and dropping or navigating through the keyboard to put them in the right spot. So,
Michael?
but yes, that was a much more convoluted process before without that accessibility checker to take advantage of that option. So, all righty. Well, we are at the end of our main section. So we are at 5:56. So let's get a 5-minute break. We'll be back at 5:01 and we'll finish up with the last section of our presentation today, which will be about delivery of a presentation. Ready, we're at 5 o'clock. So we are in the home stretch. And with no more exercises, we'll still be on this main deck. So hopefully, if anyone was disrupted by my switching back and forth between the files, that won't occur any longer at this point. So we are on slide 57, the delivery section of an accessible PowerPoint presentation. One thing we want to do is, again, strive to be seen. We want to face the audience. We don't want to hide behind the lectern or any filters. If we're online, filters can disrupt our view or our appearance to other people. Again, as I spoke to the original story I told you earlier about the person walking in the way of the ASL interpreter, that can be disruptive. Again, we want to make sure that they can be heard. Again, if someone who maybe is hard of hearing and maybe they rely on lip reading, being able to see your face, that's something that they would rely on. So again, literally facing the audience will be helpful in that kind of respect. Also going back to the online platforms, if you have a busy background, sometimes you have Zoom and you have all your naked apartment behind you, that might be distracting from what you're trying to present. So if you have like in one of those built-in backgrounds, it's more demure, I guess, is the word nowadays. Something like that that's less distracting. So that way the focus is more on you rather than what's around you. Also, one thing we want to do is strive to be heard. The first one is one thing I'm still struggling with about speaking slowly. You don't have to speak as slowly as, say, William Shatner, where you're taking very slow delivery, but we want to make sure we get heard, what we're saying. That's also helpful for, again, for a lot of the auto captioning services. If you speak too quickly, sometimes it'll truncate words or mash words together, and the output might be not what you intended, again, because it's doing the best to discern what you're saying. And if you don't speak in a slowly or maybe clear way, it disrupts that as well. Same thing with speaking clearly. Again, we want to make sure that we're heard, we're understood. I always like to prefer to use a microphone because again, that has a higher fidelity than just relying on, say, the ambiance of a room. When we do questions, so that's one thing I like about Access U, where we have the questions that are relayed over the microphone directly. But again, if you don't have a microphone, the idea of repeating what the person said, again, sometimes your mic may not pick up the question that someone asked in the room. So if you repeat that, that's very helpful. Also, as a presenter, if you don't have an answer already in mind, locked and loaded, ready to go, repeating the question can jog that out of your memory in a way that kind of makes you look like you knew exactly what you're talking about the whole time. So that kind of helps you as well to have that ready. Another thing too is also minimizing background noise. Sometimes that can't be helped. In one of the sessions I went to earlier, there was some noise outside the hall. That was somebody, I guess they were banging on a dumpster, and he had to basically say, "Are we being attacked? Should we evacuate?" Because the noise, and I think it came through over the Zoom, so he just wanted to be sure. Again, if you're over Zoom, sometimes if you have like kids, your dog gets a little hyper, you don't want that to be distracting to folks. Anything that might distract from your presentation, you want to minimize that as best as you can. Again, some things, like I said with the fellow earlier, that was outside of his control, but you try to do your best as you can to make sure that you're understood when you deliver your presentation. And again, strive to be understood. One thing we want to use plain language. Typically, when we're delivering, any of our presentations, we're delivering new knowledge to someone who's not familiar with it. Even if it's a refresher course, some things may not have been picked up the first time around. So if you have any kind of jargon, we want to make sure we define that. If it's something essential like a technical term or maybe a technical phrase, we want to make sure that people understand what we mean when we say those things. For an international audience, I would probably recommend not using idioms, because that, again, may have unintended consequences. People may think, oh, a totally different, they may take a totally different meaning from what you intended. I know in one of my early on sessions here at Access U, I had mentioned that, all the presentation materials were on the house. And then somebody asked me like, well, what's the roof access? And I'm like, oh, no, I did not mean literally on the house. I meant they were free. You could have them without cost. And I never said it again, because I'm like, yeah, for that person, that was an unfamiliar idiom. Again, we can't make those kind of assumptions. So we want to be more, again, clear in what we're trying to say and make sure we get understood. Again, if we have acronyms, we want to make sure that those are defined. Again, for a new audience, usually acronyms are probably going to be very foreign to them, especially with government. There's a lot of acronyms out there. So we want to make sure, if it's something like maybe FBI, maybe most people know, but it might be helpful to say that that's the Federal Bureau of Investigation, just to make sure that that's clear. Again, unfamiliar terms, it's helpful to define those so that way people will know what you're talking about, especially something that you may have to repeat throughout your presentation. Maybe the first time you encounter them is enough to define it, and then hopefully at that time they retain the knowledge as they go through the presentation and have that there. And one thing I always recommend is allow the audience to process what the information you're giving them. Sometimes I've seen folks, I don't know if it's a lack of maybe preparation, maybe it's nerves on the account of the presenter, but they blaze through a presentation as if like they were challenged to do it in under an hour or something like that. And it's just, they speak too quickly. Even if they're understood and they can be heard, their diction is great. People just don't have time to absorb it if it's going too quickly. So that's why I bring in the breaks in my presentations. Again, I know this is a long presentation, but I try to give breaks so people can retain the knowledge a little better. One of the sessions I went last year at Access U there was a fellow who gave a talk about how if you do bite size, people only remember the first and the end of the bite. They don't remember the middle as much. And so I purposely set up my presentation so that way you'll remember the stuff right before the breaks. Like when we talked about alt text. that little discussion I did there, took a break. So that way, hopefully that will retain better for y'all. Same thing with the talk about the discussion we had about the reading order. That's a very important thing to do. And I always put that last because I always recommend do that so that way you remember that better. If you take anything else, the all text discussion and the discussion about the reading order should be probably the more main things you take. But I usually try to take breaks between each of the slides themselves to kind of give people the way to process what I'm saying. Even though like I said, I know I have a tendency to talk quickly sometimes, but at least I try to take breaks at the end of every slide, just so there's that little bit of, even if a microsecond, it's enough of a gap so people can understand. And so I mean, if you kind of adopt that, that might help as well. And I think it also helps for folks that maybe, again, going back to the idea of nerves, just take a breath, even if for yourself. If you feel nervous when you're doing a presentation, if it's stage fright, that you feel like, if you give yourself just that moment to breathe, that helps the audience and helps you out as a presenter. And usually that might be enough to get you over your stage fright, if you're going forward. Another thing you want to do is also describe things fully on the slides. If you notice, as I've gone through, sometimes I'll mention the titles at the very top. I'll read some of the text, especially some of the more pertinent text. I'll read that verbatim, and sometimes I'll just freehand off of everything else. Graphics in particular, I try to describe as they are. Again, for some folks, we have a gentleman here today who is blind, but even if he weren't here, I want to make sure that people who, again, in the Zoom audience, there may be folks that are blind out there that I'm not aware of, that I want to make sure they get the benefit of what I'm displaying on the slides themselves. And so I want to make sure that's being said. And you may have noticed so far that I tend to talk about the slide numbers as I go through. That's helpful for orientation. When someone is going through the slides, especially if it's recorded later on, they say like, well, I don't remember exactly where it was, but I'm going to, scan through YouTube or wherever it's being hosted. And if I pick up the slide number, like, oh, okay, I know he's here. So that was probably towards the beginning or the end or wherever the number was. And that may help them localize where they're at. Of course, the better things may also say where you have those stops on YouTube, we can set chapters. If you can do that, that's great. That way people know exactly where the slides are. But at least you can kind of give them a break every so often as you're visually speaking, or rather, as you're presenting. You can actually speak to that by saying that out loud, and that'll help people. Because at least that way it'll be part of the transcript that you're generating, or should be generating if you're going to do a video archive of your file. So anyway, like I said, just in this case, I have a giant, delicious picture of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich because at the time I was hungry. And I figured, well, let me describe this fully. And it just looks delicious. So, but again, if it's on there, it's got to serve first. Normally, this would be a decorative image, but it serves the purpose to support my point of describing the slide fully. So that's why that one's there. I'm sure my boss may disagree, but I'm running this thing. And another thing also, when you do a live presentation, you may often have question and answer sessions. Sometimes this will be discreetly after the end of it. I like the ones where we have the interaction like we've done today in the midst of it. For some folks, again, maybe for them, they feel like having it discreetly at the end helps them manage the presentation a little better. Or especially if it's something very technical, you don't want to get off in the weeds sometimes. Again, there's an idiom. You want to make sure that you can discuss things at length, maybe at the end rather than in the middle, because that may cause some people to lose track, mentally of what's being discussed. So either way, like I said, if you have a question and answer session in a physical venue, we want to make sure we have microphones, as XSU has done every time I've been here for questions. If you have a virtual meeting, you can have an assistant manage the questions. Thank you very much. If they have anything out there. And also, again, if you have any questions that may be unheard, maybe there was some difficulty, by all means, just repeat them. And if they have comments as well, repeat them for the audience for the benefit of the recording, especially if it's something that's going to be archived in a, like a YouTube channel or just in your own hosting to make sure it's available for future audiences. And speaking of audiences, one thing I always recommend for folks is that when you do a presentation, I mean, right now you are my primary audience. Those of you that are here in this room and those who are watching this live on Zoom. But there's a secondary audience, and probably I will never meet those folks. Those will be the folks that those of you that are here in the presentation will relay this information onto. You might say, I saw this really cool presentation on PowerPoint at Access U, and the guy's going to let me share the files with you. That's my secondary audience. And those are the ones really this whole presentation is about. Because again, we do the best we can for those that are going to be in the room, the accommodations we discussed at the very beginning, but there's always a secondary audience. For anything we create, someone else beyond that person you gave it to is going to get that knowledge. And ultimately, we want to make sure that we're ready for that. You know, again, if we have any audio or video recordings, we want to make sure those are, you know, we have captions, we have transcripts, so that way they have that benefit. You know, if it's going to be archived someplace, we want to make sure that they have that as well, because that's the secondary audience that you're going to have when that's archived somewhere else. The other thing about that is if you have any handouts or materials like what I'm distributing with this presentation, those must be accessible too. I mean, there's no point in going through having a great accessible PowerPoint presentation and you have maybe Word files or video files that accompany it, but they're inaccessible. You've already cut yourself down. So, you know, again, if we're going to walk the walk about being accessible professionals, we need to make sure we're producing accessible products, not just in PowerPoint, but anything that accompanies it. So again, we want to make sure we do our best to be understood. And with that, we'll go to our afterward. These are the resources I took to do the bulk of our presentation here. One of these is from the W3C, their Web Accessibility Initiative, WAI for short. They had an article on how to make your presentations accessible to all, and they have a very large bit of information about that. It also talks about, like I said, about venue aspects, which I talked a little bit about here, and it goes into a lot more detail than we could do in 3 hours. So that's a very big resource as well. WebAIM, Web Accessibility in Mind. They have a short article about PowerPoint accessibility. So this is kind of the high points we talked about today. But again, those are the two, I think, best resources other than my presentation that you can rely on to guide you as you guys work on PowerPoint presentations in the future. So with that, do we have any other questions before we convene for today? All righty, let's hear them.
So most of the time with the templates, you get in the side by side, they're actually, I guess it would be vertical side by side. And I think you had a couple of slides that were horizontal side by side.
Mhm.
Did you just resize them and maneuver them the way that you wanted them to use the content placeholders?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
But when you do that, you want to make sure you have your reading order properly set. So that way, again, if we're going to put content vertically or horizontally, again, people tend to read top to bottom. So whatever's going to be the title and follows that next should be the next thing in the reading order and so forth down the line.
I actually have 3 questions. So,
Okay.
and I have a tendency to alternate like text on left, image on right, and then image on left, text on right, just to make it, is that, I mean, it's still accessible because that's more to break up the visual impact, I guess?
Yeah.
There isn't anything wrong with that,
No,
right?
that's perfectly fine.
Okay.
Like I said, that's perfectly acceptable because again, title's always going to be first. Whatever's going to be on the left-hand side, be it an image, text, that should be second. And then whatever follows should be third if you're to use that 3 placeholder.
So that's where the
layout.
reading order also comes in to make sure that you've got it presented for the readers the way that you want it.
Exactly. Again, like I said, if you had an image on a slide that was on the right-hand side, but you had that in the second in the order, that would be an error because
Okay.
it would be, you know, you'd be reading from right to left in that instance. And it may not be a big inconvenience or even a big barrier, but it's enough to fall into a bad habit of not keeping up with that. So kind of keeping that discipline, like you said, if you change up the layouts where you have text on one side and the graphic on the other, that's perfectly fine, but just make sure you got the reading order right, regardless of that.
And my last question is regarding animations.
Mhm.
I use PowerPoint to create the background for training videos. And so a lot of them do have the animations that come through. And I know that not all of the content can fall in a placeholder.
Right.
Like there's, like there's text that has a companion image that's sort of flying together. How do you do accessibility and handle accessibility for that?
Those, it depends on how you're presenting them. Because like you said, if you're making them for like videos, you're actually kind of using PowerPoint to create an animation for another format. You're kind
Yes,
of,
it's for like a process. How do you do this process? You click here and you bring the image in, you click here, you bring the image in.
right, you're
that kind of
describing
thing.
something like that. But if
Yeah.
you're doing something like this, more of a flat presentation, I would just go with the final product at the very end. Like if you're
Rather
doing
than like, do this bullet point, talk about it, this bullet point, talk about it.
Well, if you did that, I would probably recommend making a slide about that first bullet point.
Versus having three bullet points that you just talk about individually. and
Yeah,
Bring them in.
exactly.
Okay.
Or like I have seen sometimes, like in this case, where I have an example on the slide right now, where I have 3 list items, and I've seen people like speak to the first one, and then the next slide is basically this one, the second list item rolling in, and then the next one is the third one rolling in. But if I were to make this into a flat one, this is the end product of what I was talking about. So if I was going to distribute this one, this is the one I would distribute. This would be, again, the one with the fancy transitions would be the one that I would use live. But then the one I would give to the audience would be the one where it's all flat there
Okay.
at one time. And that would be
That's actually-
beneficial for someone using a screen reader.
That's good to hear because I'm also providing a PDF of the presentation as an alternative. And so I know I've had to switch how things appear on the page so that all the animations can be seen, which some of them have been hidden with the animations that are in there.
Right, right.
And I think this is also where that, I forget the name, it's like the selection pane.
Mhm.
You can also check to see, that should show all of the animations and all the images and everything, and I can check and see how all of that works. that
Right,
way.
right.
Okay, great, thank
Yeah.
you.
But again, like if someone's using a screen reader, they're typically going to be looking at a very static, flat presentation. The ones you're talking about is again, more like you're preparing it for a video. And that's appropriate for that use again. But don't confuse the two. Don't give that file to someone with a screen reader because you'll cause them troubles. Question over here.
Thank you. I may have missed it, but did you cover tables?
No, I did not.
Okay.
And I purposely did not talk about it because they're very problematic in PowerPoint. And I typically don't recommend, even though there's an option, just like we have a Smarter, is a way to put that in. It's the same mechanism that brings it in.
Mhm.
There's really not a way to set headers in tables that are other than the default where you have the column headers. If you have a table that has any kind of row headers, there's no way to define that within PowerPoint. And that's why I really don't speak to it because it's a very complicated process and it really doesn't result in anything useful. So I kind of omitted it, but you kind of caught me on that one. But that's good because we're discussing that now. I would say if you're going to have any kind of a communication that's going to have a table in it, I would probably refer that to a Word document because Word can do that a little better than PowerPoint. It doesn't do it the best way, but it's better than PowerPoint because PowerPoint really doesn't really work at that at all. So thanks for the question though.
Thank you. And I have one more if it's okay.
Mhm.
Since images don't show up in the outline view, if users are only using the outline view, what would your advice be? Like recommend that they open it and read through it in edit view or presentation view to access those images, or just a totally like alternative format like a PDF?
It depends on the user. Because again, if the outline view helps more folks who are using a text-based method, like a screen reader, and so it relies on text only. Now, again, someone who's using the screen reader can navigate. I know someone who's blind who actually creates PowerPoint presentations as part of her job. She's totally blind, but she can navigate all the various panes within PowerPoint quite well. But again, she's well versed at that. For a typical user though, like I said, we want to make it as simple as possible so there's no difficulty for the screen reader. Not that the user has any issue with it, it's just that the interface between the screen reader and PowerPoint isn't always the best. And so that's why I was saying, you want to keep more things text-based, put that in the outline view, but if you have any images, again, make sure they have the alt text. So if someone navigates to the main panel of or the main pane of your PowerPoint file, and navigates to an image, they have that alt text available to them, regardless if they can see it or not. So. Any other questions? All right, so to recap, like I said, we looked at how we could prepare for a presentation, an accessible presentation. We spent the bulk of our time learning how to design an accessible presentation. And finally, we talked about how we can deliver an accessible presentation. So hopefully with all the methods we discussed today, that'll help you from here on out, working with PowerPoint. And again, I always say that I think it was discussed in one of the earlier discussions we had, I think with the legal update, we're all basically advocates for what we do here with accessibility. It's the reason why you are here at Access U. I don't think that anyone here has ever come to Access U with just kind of like, I'll just go see what it's about, without realizing you're going to be an advocate at some point, even in a small measure. And so again, for those of you, I think you work mostly in PowerPoint, use these methods as best as you can, distribute the the materials that I have. Like I said, you're free to use those. You can strip these things out, use them as they are. Be very careful with them because again, I've given you a gift, but you can always use that for evil. Don't be evil. But I don't think you will. But again, my secondary audience, try to advise them. Try to use this the best way that you can. And again, and that's why I gave you the resources before as well. That way, if people have questions, they can refer back to this presentation if it's accessed on, if it's on Access U for a while and they allow access to it outside of conference attendees. If not, my materials, I call them open source. I created them. They're free. Anyone can use that. So do with those as you will. And again, the resources I talked to about the previous slide, those are available as well for free. So anyone can use those as well as a way to inform themselves. So with that, thank you for coming today. I hope you had a great time today with mine and other presentations. And for the next 2 days, I hope you have a good time too at the remainder of Access U.